The first thing Kiara heard was a strange squeak, methodical and measured, having nothing to do with a living organism, and Kiara herself had been walking for several minutes along a long dark corridor that seemed endless. How had she gotten here? God only knew. Sometimes she had to move by feel, touching the walls. It was hard to say how long her forced journey lasted, but when Ciara saw a light ahead, her heart thumped with joy. The bright flash made her squeeze her eyes shut, a deafening noise in her ears causing her to feel dizzy and blurred. She shook her head, uncomprehending, and then felt a slight nudge on her shoulder, as if someone was trying to wake her up. Ciara tried to open her eyes at that moment, but it was difficult. Her hearing had recovered earlier, and now she could hear what was going on around her. "Doctor, the patient is awake." "She's awake. Do you hear?" came an excited voice. Ciara tensed. "Doctor, what does a doctor have to do with this? Is she in the hospital?" Just then there was a noise, a door opened, and a rough male voice spoke. "She's awake, you say? Good. Emily, why didn't the instruments work?" "I'm gonna have to call the repairman again, Eugene. Vitals are normal. Pulse is stable and blood pressure like an astronaut," a female voice replied. The doctor paused for a moment, then asked, "Ciara, can you hear us? If so, please give us some kind of sign, like moving a finger or opening your eyelids." Ciara wanted to say something in response, but the lump in her throat prevented her from doing so. Her mouth was dry, and she was very thirsty. She opened her eyes a little, however, and immediately saw the medical devices next to the bed. There were tubes and wires running from them to her body. "My God, this is the intensive care unit," a thought flashed through her mind. Seeing her reaction, the doctor smiled. "Congratulations on your return to our world, Ciara." Ciara tried again to say something in response, but her tongue stuck to her palate and she could only sigh softly. Eugene stood by her bedside for a moment, scrutinized the readings, and satisfied, left the room. Ciara was left alone with the nurse Emily, who gently applied a cotton swab soaked in water to her lips. "You can't drink much yet, but it's okay. It's temporary. You're doing great." "A year in a coma. Everyone had given up hope, and you're back," Emily said quietly. Ciara's eyes filled with tears. "A year in a coma. What about Eugene? Where's her husband? Why isn't he around?" She had no answer to that question. Her recovery was slow, as if the disease still did not want to let her out of clutches. It wasn't until a week later that Ciara learned that a year ago she had been in a terrible car accident. Their car had fallen off a bridge into a river. She couldn't remember the details because she suffered from traumatic amnesia, but the nurses told her the most important thing. On that fateful day, Ciara was returning from business negotiations with her husband, Eugene. The road was slippery after the rain, and she failed to control her car. Eugene died instantly, and she was miraculously saved. When Ciara learned of this, she cried, clutching her fingers to the edge of the mattress. It took about a month for her to finally recover. First, all the tubes and wires were removed from her body. Then she was disconnected from the machines. After that, she underwent a course of rehabilitation therapy and finally received the long-awaited discharge. Eugene wished her never to go to the hospital again, so that it would not happen again. And Amelie, like a sister, hugged her and cried. The nurse had grown very attached to her patient over the past year, caring for her. There was no one to take Ciara away. Eugene was dead, and her father had died 3 years ago, leaving her a nice inheritance. After leaving the clinic, the first thing Ciara did was to call a cab and go to the cemetery. The driver turned out to be an understanding man, did not ask unnecessary questions. To find Eugene's grave, Ciara asked the elderly cemetery caretaker for help. Noah listened patiently to her, thin and pale, and then peered into the register he had meticulously kept for years. "Eugene, 5th grave, number 83, the older man said. Then he added, "If you need me, I can take you there. It's no trouble at all." Ciara flinched and lowered her eyes in embarrassment. "No, thank you, I'm fine. I'll do it myself," she replied. The caretaker shrugged and went back to his room. Ciara walked on, looking around carefully. She happened to see Eugene's grave from a distance, without knowing why. She knew immediately that the massive wooden cross with the plaque belonged to him. The gravesite was littered with artificial wreaths and fresh flowers that had already dried in the hot sun like herbarium. 2 tall men in dark shirts stood at the grave. They were leaning on the memorial table and talking animatedly about something. The strangers tensed when they saw Ciara, but did not break off the conversation, obviously to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Who were they and what were they doing here? Ciara didn't understand. As she stepped closer, she nodded politely, and immediately she heard foreign speech. Kiara flinched in surprise, but quickly pulled herself together. One of her 2 college degrees was in translation, and in a strange irony of fate, she recognized the language immediately. What's more, she was able to translate the phrase in her mind word for word. "Who the hell is that ghost? It's like she was taken down from the cross," said one of the foreigners. "How would I know?" "Probably someone Eugene knows. He's a real ladies' man. He never missed a skirt, and I don't think he misses a skirt now," the other one said, grinning. Chiara turned pale, but bowed her head mournfully, trying not to show her feelings. What she had heard caused her great shock. Who were these people? Business partners, acquaintances, investors? And why would they allow themselves to talk about Eugene like that? Meanwhile, one of the strangers again snidely remarked, "Eugene is a master of all sorts of schemes. He sent us out in this heat to lay wreaths like we had nothing else to do." Sweat beaded on Ciara's forehead. Standing with her back to the men, she could feel their eyes on her. The storm of emotions was tearing her up inside, but Ciara was determined to play her part to the end. She continued to pretend that she didn't understand the language of these strange guests. Meanwhile, the foreigners mumbled something inaudible and headed for the exit of the cemetery. The sun was at its zenith, and Ciara felt dizzy. As she gave the strangers a distasteful glance, she watched them get into a large SUV. She couldn't see the color of the car because of the distance. Her first thought was to chase them down, ask the caretaker to call the police. But after weighing the pros and cons, she realized that no good would come of it. For one thing, she simply had nothing to charge them with, and no one would arrest foreign nationals. It wouldn't take long for an international scandal. You have to understand. But the conversation of these people really disliked Ciara. Besides, they were talking without a shadow of embarrassment, chatting about something, as if they were not afraid to be heard. But how could they know that Ciara knew their language? It was not for nothing that she was fond of reading foreign books in the original. What were they saying about Eugene? Why were they talking about him in such a negative way? Shaking her head, Ciara said goodbye to her husband, touching her lips to his picture. Being near the grave was becoming unbearable. Back to the gate, she walked back down another alley. Why did I go this way, she thought. Most likely she had turned down it absent-mindedly. Thoughts of the strange conversation between the 2 men were still lingering in her mind. Did they really know Eugene? Or had they just gotten the grave mixed up? At that moment, Ciara suddenly heard strange sounds to her right. She flinched and froze in place. The sound repeated, and now she guessed it was someone's moaning. It was coming from the nearest gravesite. Goosebumps ran down her spine. My God, who's moaning, she thought. Moving closer, Ciara was stunned. Behind the mound, a man of about 35, dressed in rags, was crouched over the grave. It was most likely a vagrant. Ciara frowned. Had he gotten drunk? Or couldn't resist drinking in a graveyard? Ciara thought, but something in his voice struck her as odd. "Help. I don't feel well," moaned the man. She bent over the stranger and touched his forehead. The tramp's skin burned like fire, but there was no odor of alcohol from him. Naturally, she couldn't lift a grown man by herself, especially since she'd recently been discharged from the clinic after a year in a coma. Barely containing her excitement, Ciara quickly went to the cemetery keeper. "Oh, please help. There's a man down there," she pleaded. Noah reacted quickly, rising from his chair and following her without asking any questions. When he saw the tramp stretched out on the ground, he exclaimed, "Oh my God, it's Billy. He's been moonlighting here for about a year now, cleaning graves, painting fences. But he can't stand alcohol. What happened to him?" Ciara shrugged, and together with the caretaker, they led a weakening Billy into the gatehouse. Nothing. I guess he ate something bad, poor guy. We'll give him a gastric lavage and get him back on his feet," Noah muttered. Gastric lavage? Ciara was surprised. What do you know about it? The guard paused for a moment to catch his breath. "Of course I do. How could I not? I spent almost 40 years of my life as an ambulance paramedic. You can't tell me what I've seen," Noah said with a smile. Ciara nodded and looked at the guard with undisguised respect. Noah was a real professional. He quickly prepared slightly salted warm water and began pouring it into Billy's mouth almost forcefully. The tramp mumbled something unintelligible, did not want to open his mouth, but Noah knew his business. Soon his stomach cleared, and Billy felt noticeably better. Ciara was not present. She tactfully went outside. She didn't feel well. The abundance of negative information made her dizzy and thirsty. As if reading her thoughts, Noah came out to her with a cup of cold water. "Honey, it's from the well. It tastes great. When I go to the country, I always have a bottle to spare," he said. "Thank you so much," Ciara breathed out in relief. She thought for a moment, then said, I can't judge, but I think Billy might have been poisoned. All the signs are there, and the poison is so strong. It's all right, he has 9 lives, Noah said with a smile. Chiara raised an eyebrow in surprise. Poisoned? Or maybe he poisoned himself with something. No, I'm 100% sure it's food poisoning. He ate something wrong. That's all. But it's okay. Billy's tough. He can handle it. He's good at his job. Too bad he's an orphan with nothing to show for it. It's a good thing he was smart enough not to get mixed up with gangs, Noah said. Chiara nodded in agreement, then asked, Listen, Noah, do you happen to remember the funeral of my husband, Eugene Kiriev? I was in the hospital then. Maybe you noticed something strange? Strange? What could have been weird about it? Although, there weren't a lot of people there. The coffin was closed, and they filmed the whole procession. The gravediggers were so drunk, they barely made it out of the cemetery. Nothing else happened. Only 2 men were hanging around the grave recently, doing something in their own way. I didn't get it. You must have seen them. They were strange. Why they came, it's unclear, Noah answered thoughtfully. That's all the information I need. Billy, get well soon. If you need anything, call me. I'll leave you my number. You never know, he added. Thank you. I was in the restaurant business before the accident. I'm going to inspect the place and see what's going on. Chiara said goodbye and got up from the bench. Take care of yourself, sweetie. I'm not inviting you to visit. You know, it's a cemetery here. It's no time for guests, Noah said with a smile. Chiara shook her head and headed for the exit. Calling a cab, she decided to go to a restaurant, which had probably fallen into disrepair during her absence. Who had been running things while she had been away? It was a difficult question to answer. What was her surprise when she saw that the restaurant, her brainchild, was padlocked. As she got out of the cab, she ran to the door and noticed that there was a sign hanging on it that read in paint, "Closed." Wow, what the hell is this? Where's the receptionist? Where's the maintenance staff? Chiara exclaimed. There was no answer. She sat down on a nearby bench, wrapped her arms around her head, and plunged into thought. Unbeknownst to herself, Chiara began to remember her past. Without wanting to, Chiara's thoughts returned to the day when her life was divided into before and after, and everything had started so brightly. Everything around her seemed like a fairy tale. The first rays of sunlight were shining through the thin curtains, caressing her face. She lay in bed and did not hurry to open her eyes, enjoying the warmth and comfort. Last night had passed in a hectic pace. Final preparations for the 5-year anniversary of the restaurant opening, phone calls, endless checks, it all piled up on her, and fatigue literally knocked her off her feet. Chiara took a deep breath, feeling her muscles begin to relax a little. Truth be told, she always got up early. It was a habit she'd picked up since high school, when, as an honor student, she'd rush to class to learn new things. She especially liked the foreign language classes taught by Vincent, who considered her his favorite. Mark my words, girl, you'll make a great translator. Yes, your math teacher thinks you'll be an economist, but I'm sure you'll make your life in foreign languages, the elderly teacher said, fixing his slipping glasses. Chiara only smiled in response, because at that time she could not make a final choice. Now that she had her own restaurant, her schedule was even busier. But despite the fatigue, she never complained. She loved her business, had dreamed of it since she was a child. Her father, Kai, had once invested in the abandoned building of the town's canteen, which had been given a new life with his arrival. Over time, the place had become an elite restaurant called Moonlight, where all the color of the city liked to relax. Chiara slowly stretched out in bed, stretching out the muscles that had stiffened overnight. Eugene slept peacefully next to her. His lips were slightly open in sleep, making him look like a fish. Chiara smiled and stood up quietly. Things weren't starting out easy for her. Her father had essentially handed her an old, dilapidated canteen building that was yet to become a restaurant. She spent her days looking for the right construction crew to renovate the building, studying business plans and working out the menu to the last detail. Eugene repeatedly doubted the success of her venture, but Claire was adamant. The morning promised to be busy. There were important negotiations to be held with an investor at the Chiara River Country Retreat, where she hoped to get funding for her idea of opening a summer playground. Truth be told, she had already pictured it in her dreams: cozy outdoor tables, soft plaids for cool evenings, the aromas of cooking food and live music. In Chiara's opinion, this was exactly what would make her establishment special, to add charm to it and attract new customers. But to realize this idea, she needed money. The investor, Nicky Golikov, though interested in the project, was still hesitant. not sure of its profitability. Kiara had to convince him that the summer area would be the highlight of the restaurant and would attract even more guests. She quietly walked out of the bedroom, trying not to wake her husband. Truth be told, Eugene had always been an owl, calling himself that, while Sierra considered herself a lark. She walked over to the window and breathed in the fresh morning air. Looking out at the awakening city, Kiara felt a surge of energy and strength. She knew that she would succeed and her dream would definitely come true. The main thing was to be confident and not be afraid to take risks. Kiara went into the bathroom, turned on the water, and washed her face with the cool stream. Opening her closet, she chose a slinky dress that accentuated her figure. She wanted to look feminine, but formal at the same time. She chose stylish shoes with low heels that made her feel confident and comfortable. In the mirror, she saw the reflection of a beautiful, confident woman, and in that moment, Sierra couldn't help but admire herself. Smiling, she walked over to the bed, kissed the sleeping Eugene, and whispered softly, "I love you, darling." Her husband mumbled something inaudible and rolled over onto his other side. Shira walked outside and headed to her car. Getting behind the wheel, she turned the ignition key and started the engine. At that moment, she felt something strange in the steering, whether it was the brakes or the chassis. Except that the car didn't drive like it used to. No, the brakes, of course, did not fail, but they seemed alien, as if she was not driving her own car. At the restaurant that day, it was business as usual. Dan, the receptionist, had been defiant in his boss's absence, especially with his subordinates, berating the janitors for not cleaning the yard properly, or, in fact, for being late. But as soon as Sierra appeared on stage, the administrator immediately panicked. He mumbled something inaudible and quickly retreated to his office. In fact, Shira had never scolded Maggie for being late, and it wasn't just the disruption of public transportation. Maggie was raising her late sister's 3 children alone, and she had to work hard. Sierra often gave bonuses to the dishwasher so she could make her little ones happy with something tasty. Basically, the day before the horrible accident was nothing special. Eugene volunteered to drive to the negotiations and ask Sierra to pick him up near the city bridge. "Okay, honey. I'll be there in about 10 minutes, she said with a smile, not even realizing what was about to happen to her. The last thing she remembered was the screeching of ambulance sirens in the sticky, impenetrable darkness she had fallen into for a long 12 months. Shara still couldn't remember who had pulled her out of the sinking car. She always wore her seatbelt when driving, which meant she simply wouldn't have had time to get out on her own. Amully, the nurse at the emergency room, shrugged, and the doctor didn't know how she'd escaped. Chasing away the unpleasant memories, Chiara shook her head and reached into her bag where her phone was. Dialing Dan's receptionist's number, she pressed the phone hopefully to her ear. An excited voice came through the receiver. "Chiara, is that you?" "Yes, it's me, Dan. Hello." I'm standing at the door of the restaurant and admiring the sign that says closed. "What's the matter? Why is it closed in the middle of the day?" she asked, barely containing her excitement. There was a tense pause in the phone for a moment. Then the receptionist said, "Chiara, you probably don't know, but we've been closed for 8 months. I'm now working somewhere else entirely, the Prometheus restaurant. You know, the one by the waterfront, the competitors." "I see. Why is the restaurant closed? Where's all the staff?" Ciara wouldn't stop. "Why is it closed? What were we supposed to use to buy food? Taxes and salaries. There's no money in the accounts. On the day of the accident, everything disappeared for some reason. I even filed a police report, but nothing could be found, so I quit. You have to live on something," Dan said sadly. Ciara shook her head, then said goodbye and disconnected the call. What else was she supposed to do? Make a scene? Dan had a dependent, disabled father, after all. Was he supposed to wait for his mistress to come out of her coma? Or if she'd ever come out? But where did the money go? Who could have withdrawn it on the day of the accident? It certainly added to the problem, though that's not surprising. A year between life and death is no fun. Getting up from the bench, Kira wandered toward the house. Luckily, it wasn't far. The house was only half a kilometer from the restaurant. Meanwhile, a very different scene was unfolding in the cemetery. The sun's rays came through a gap in the shutters and fell directly on Billy's face. The drifter grimaced and covered his eyes, trying to shield himself from the light. His head ached, as if a dozen nails had been hammered into it. From somewhere in the depths of consciousness came vague, frightening sounds. Billy tried to make them out, but his thoughts were as confused as a drunken man's. He opened his eyes and struggled to raise his head. He found himself lying on a pile of old rags. In the cramped, dusty room, the walls were boarded up and the ceiling felt like it was about to collapse. A shiver ran through Billy's body. He tried to remember how he had gotten here. Vague images flashed through his mind. A cemetery, two tall men with strange accents, a bad taste in his mouth and a nauseous feeling, and then darkness. Billy struggled to rise, leaning against the wall. His stomach was churning unpleasantly. He looked around. The room resembled either an old lady's room or some kind of back room. An icon hung over a simple wooden table, and a yellowed lamp with a shade stood on the table. Suddenly, there was a creak. Someone was opening the door. Billy turned around sharply. In the doorway stood Noah, the cemetery caretaker, with whom Billy was well acquainted. "Hello," Billy barely breathed out, clutching his head. What's wrong?" The older man raised his eyebrows in surprise. "You're losing it, brother. We brought you and a woman back from the dead. What the hell did you eat, sweetheart?" Billy shook his head. "No, I didn't eat nothing. I think I was poisoned." Noah looked at him thoughtfully. "Poisoned? Who do you think did it?" "Two tall men in dark shirts. I met them at the cemetery. They gave me a soda. It was hot," Billy mumbled, struggling to find his words. Noah shook his head. "That's the news." "What? They just decided to poison you like that? Why would they do that?" "I don't know," Billy whispered. "All right, sit down. Tell me everything in order," Noah said, gesturing to the only chair in the room. Billy began to tell the story, rambling and confusing the details. He talked about the meeting with the foreigners, about the strange drink that made him sick and gave him such a headache that he passed out near a grave. "What did they talk to you about? What did they talk about?" Noah asked, looking anxiously at Billy. The drifter frowned. "I don't really remember. They spoke with an accent, and among themselves in their own language. A foreign language, of course. But what they asked me about was the case when I saved a woman in the river. She fell off a bridge into the water." "And what did you tell them? Did she fall off the bridge?" Noah was interested. "Well, yes, from the bridge. But she was in the car, driving, and I dived in after her. The people on the shore panicked, so I kicked the windshield and pulled her out. She was covered in blood. Her head was smashed in, but she was breathing. I left her on the shore and ran away," Billy said quietly. "Why did he run away?" Noah wondered. Noah didn't stop. "Why? Why put up with it? You're like a little kid. You know it's not reasonable for me to meet with the police, and there are journalists there cluttering up the shore like a jam bathhouse." Noah shook his head. His face reflected deep thoughtfulness. "What exactly did these foreigners ask you?" Noah finally broke the long pause. Billy grinned. "Just some nonsense. They asked if there was a man sitting next to the owner of the car. I mean, a passenger. And was he?" Noah got suspicious. "There was no passenger. The cabin was empty. I noticed it right away when I smashed out the windshield, and the water in the river was clear, so you could see through the glass," Billy answered bluntly, wincing at the pain. "Something tells me you shouldn't have messed with them. They asked about the accident for a reason." "Oh, for a reason," said the watchman. "I think you'd better stay with me for a while. You know, out of harm's way." Billy nodded, trying to control his dizziness. "All right, you get some rest. I'll make you some hot tea with Maggie later," Noah said, and left the back room. Billy was alone. He lay there, trying to push away the horrible thoughts that were growing in his head by the minute. He thought about his life, how he had ended up on the street, how he had tried to survive. Closing his eyes, Billy felt tired from his conversation with the caretaker and fell asleep almost immediately. He had the same dream again. He saw his father young, strong, with a kind smile. His father taught him to play soccer, told him bedtime stories, and promised to take him fishing. Billy was happy, but suddenly his father disappeared, and for some reason little Billy found himself in a cemetery. There were dark graves all around, and in the distance he could hear someone's muffled crying. He ran through the cemetery again. But where to? From whom? That's what Billy didn't know to this day. Billy. He woke up. Noah was standing over him with a cup of hot tea in his hands. "You all right, kid? You got a headache?" "Yeah, a little, but it's better," Billy said, stretching. "That's good. Have a cup of tea. You need to come to your senses," Noah said, and put the cup on the table. Billy drank the tea, inhaling the pleasant aroma of herbs, which was good for relieving dizziness. His mood had improved considerably, although he still couldn't understand what had happened to his father and why he had ended up in an orphanage at the age of 5. Where was Daddy? 3. because he didn't look like he was sick. And why doesn't anyone know about him? Meanwhile, Ciara was returning home, where she hadn't been for exactly a year. She passed by a rowdy group of people sitting on a bench outside her house and turned onto her street. Almost immediately, she noticed a figure leaning over a garbage can. That's odd, Ciara thought to herself. Usually their neighborhood was quiet and peaceful. She stepped closer and shuddered in amazement when the man turned around at the sound of her footsteps. Although it had been many years since she had graduated from high school, Ciara immediately recognized Vincent, her former foreign language teacher. Once an intelligent and strict teacher, he now looked like a haggard vagabond. His eyes were filled with pain and his clothes were crumpled and dirty. Ciara was shocked. She couldn't believe that her teacher, who had always been an example to everyone, had stooped to such a state. "Vincent," Ciara said in a low voice. He flinched, looked around, and stepped back. Fear flashed in his eyes. "Ciara, is that you?" Vincent whispered. "Yes, it is." "What are you doing here?" "What's wrong?" Ciara asked. He lowered his head. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to show myself to you like this. It's just that I'm really hungry." At that moment, Ciara's heart literally squeezed. "So would come to my place, I'll feed you. You know how much I love to cook." The man looked at his former student uncertainly, as if not believing himself. "No, I can't do that. I don't want to make you uncomfortable." "Don't be silly, Vincent. For God's sake, let's go," Ciara exclaimed in a tone that brooked no objection, and taking the teacher's hand, she led him back to her house. Vincent walked slowly, his foot treading lightly. At home, Ciara put the kettle on the stove, then took some convenience foods out of the freezer that were well within their shelf life, and soon dinner was ready. Sure, it wasn't anything gourmet, but it was still better than leftovers from the garbage can. "Tell me what happened. Why are you outside?" Ciara asked, watching her former teacher eat greedily. "It was my own daughter, Oberyn. I lived with her for many years, raised her as my own. My wife died a long time ago, God rest her soul, and I gave her everything, the apartment, the money, and even the small savings that I had accumulated in my life, tutoring at home. And Oberyn threw me out on the street like a stray kitten, said I was a nuisance, and that she deserved a better life," Vincent said through tears. Ciara felt her heart literally bursting with pain. "Now, first of all, don't worry, I'll help you. In the meantime, you will stay with me until you regain your strength, and then we'll decide what to do next," she said confidently. Vincent looked at her with gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, girl. I can't thank you enough for your kindness." Ciara smiled. "You've always been kind to me. You were supportive during the school Olympiads. I still remember your lessons, so I just couldn't leave you in the lurch." Vincent brushed away a tear and went to the bathroom to shave and shower. Luckily, there were some of Eugene's homemade clothes in the closet that should fit. Meanwhile, Ciara noticed something odd. All the places where money and family valuables had once been lying around were now almost empty. A little change remained, but the main finances were gone. It was as if they had never existed. As she tucked herself into her bed for the first time in 12 months, Ciara caught herself thinking that this whole situation seemed odd, to say the least. Why had her restaurant ended up bankrupt? Who took the money, and how did this someone break into her house by disabling the alarm system? And then there are those mysterious foreigners at Eugene's grave. What could connect them, even if only theoretically? The next morning, Billy woke up rested and feeling much better than the day before. His headache was less severe, and the signs of the poisoning had all but disappeared. It was as if they had never happened. Noah met Billy with a smile on his face. "So you better, Billy. I've been thinking, why don't we call Ciara? You know, the woman who came by yesterday and helped me carry you to the driveway. Seems to me she's the one you saved a year ago. I don't think that's the kind of coincidence you get in life. You know how it is." Billy nodded. Then he thought about it. To tell the truth, he didn't want to meet the woman he'd once rescued. And anyway, what were they going to talk about if it had been a whole year since that day? And Billy didn't remember her much either. He didn't care. He just acted on emotion, on automatic, thinking only of how to get the unfortunate woman out of the water as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the call from Noah had alarmed Ciara. She wondered what he was going to tell her. What if Billy got worse? That's the last thing we need. I should have called an ambulance right away, Ciara thought as she walked toward the town cemetery. Meanwhile, Noah and Billy went outside to get some fresh air and do some work. Of course, the cemetery wasn't the most suitable place for walking, but they had no other choice. The sun, even though it was morning, was baking mercilessly. Billy, dressed in a worn shirt and ragged pants that had once been blue, leaned against an old tree near the cemetery gate. He squinted against the bright light and looked at Noah, who was sweeping the entrance in front of the gatehouse. "Uncle Noah, do you have any more tea left? You know, the medicinal tea." "Can I have some?" Billy muttered. "I think there's some left in the thermos." "Take it if you want it," Noah said, still working the broom. Billy was about to go when a low crying sound came from the hedge. He exchanged a meaningful glance with Noah. It was clearly a child's cry, which made Billy's heart race. "Uncle Noah, look. There's a little girl sitting by that fence," Billy said, pointing his finger in the wrong direction. The caretaker visibly tensed. In truth, children were rare in the cemetery. Usually they came here only with their parents to put flowers on the graves and say something to their deceased relatives. Noah walked away from the gatehouse and, approaching the hedge, saw a crying girl with a bag in her hands. She was small, about 7 or 8 years old, in a ragged dress, sandals 2 sizes too big, and dirty socks. "Wow, what are you doing here?" Noah asked as gently as possible. The little girl shuddered and looked up at him, her eyes full of tears. "Yeah, eating more. My name is Alice. My stepfather drinks a lot, and they send me to the cemetery to look for food on the graves. But there's not much food here, except candy," she said through her sobs. Noah looked at the girl with pity. A chill ran down his spine at her words. He had never seen such hopelessness in a child's eyes before. "Come to me," he said to Alice. "Don't worry, I'll help you. My name is Grandpa Noah, and this is my friend Billy." The girl hesitated for a moment, and then hesitantly approached the kind grandfather. As she did so, her gaze slipped cautiously toward the church. Noah noticed that the little girl had a noticeable huff on her left foot as she walked. "Don't cry," Noah said. "I'll give you some warm tea and a sausage sandwich." Alice nodded and followed obediently. Billy had never considered himself a sentimental man, but when he saw the limping girl, he could not hold back his tears. Alice ate with great appetite and clearly looked pleased. The sadness in her eyes was fading. "Thank you," she said quietly when she had finished eating. "You're welcome. You, if you want, eat some more. Don't be shy." "I suppose you live around here?" Noah asked cautiously. "Yes, not far away." "In a house at the edge of the woods by the river," Alice answered obediently. "What is your stepfather's name?" Noah asked again. "Dan," she answered. "My mom died, and he became my guardian." Noah realized that the girl was left all alone with an alcoholic, and at the same moment decided to help her. "Alice, don't worry. I'll take care of it," he said. "I'll tell the police. I'll tell them about your stepfather. He has no right to act like that," Noah said. "Thank you, Grandpa Noah. Just don't go anywhere. My stepfather is very angry and swears a lot, but when he's drunk, he's kind and sleeps a lot. I feel better this way," Alice said. The girl's words touched Billy's heart. "What do you mean?" "Some low-down bastard lives on the little girl's money and spends it all on alcohol, of course." Billy didn't consider himself a role model, but on the other hand, he'd never hurt anyone, and he'd never taken anyone else's money in his entire life. Deep down, Billy had always dreamed of having children, but he had never been able to start a family. Either he was too bad, or women love those who hold their luck by the tail. But in the last few years, he felt like nobody wanted him. The sound of the door opening brought him out of a state of sad reflection. On the threshold of the gatehouse stood Kiara in light pants and a light blouse. When she saw the little guest, she was visibly embarrassed. After all, she herself had once dreamed of having a daughter, but fate ordered otherwise, time after time depriving her of the opportunity to get pregnant. The doctors had tried one course of treatment after another, but it hadn't worked. Eugene resented her and occasionally called her an empty vessel. Chiara cried at night, face buried in her pillow, begging for help. Eugene flatly refused to take the baby from the orphanage, talking nonsense about bad heredity and not wanting to raise someone else's child. "Come in, Chiara, have a seat. I'll pour you some tea and tell you all about it. Billy will tell you if I forget anything," Noah said. "Right, Billy?" Chiara asked, looking at him. Billy nodded in embarrassment, lowering his eyes under her gaze. Noah poured the rest of the tea for everyone and began his story. As he spoke, Chiara's face brightened and darkened. Only now did she realize that the couple of foreigners had appeared at the cemetery by accident. Most likely, they had come there for one purpose: to film a report on Eugene's grave and to get rid of Billy, the drifter they had been looking for almost a year. Perhaps it was the same video report that had made the evening news. No matter how much Billy hid his face from the cameras, he still became a hero to everyone in town. But in his case, it played tricks on him. Perhaps he was saved by the fact that the same evening he changed his habitual place of residence and got a job at the city cemetery. But why did the foreigners want to eliminate him? Was it because he had seen Eugene alone in the car when it fell off the bridge? The answer was self-evident. Either Eugene's death was staged, or it was all just speculation. But if the latter was true, then where was the money from the restaurant accounts and the family heirlooms missing from the house? They couldn't have just disappeared. Noah put the final point in the tense conversation, brushing crumbs off the table with his palm. Forensics should be ordered, and it wouldn't hurt to contact a smart detective. I've got one in mind. He comes to his wife and daughter's grave every Sunday. He used to be a cop. After they died, he quit his job and went into private investigation. I've even got his phone number somewhere. Chiara looked anxiously at Billy. Forensics. What if I'm wrong? What if this is all just speculation fantasy, she asked, though deep down she knew that doubts wouldn't help. But Noah persisted. He found the number of Andrew's private investigator and called him immediately. Ciara felt her cheeks flush with shame. She had hoped to the last minute that she would be able to handle the situation without involving outsiders. After calling the detective, her hopes had been dashed. Andrew turned out to be a sturdy man in his 40s, with a keen eye and meticulousness, like a wolf on the trail. Naturally, they met not at the cemetery, but in a cozy cafe in the city. For some reason, Andrew was immediately interested in the fact that all the money from her accounts disappeared. That's something, he said, looking at her thoughtfully. The thing is, finances don't disappear without a trace. They usually leave a trail. Electronic ones, of course, the detective remarked aloud. Chiara only shrugged, plunging into the investigation headlong. Andrew took 2 weeks to investigate, politely said goodbye, gallantly paying for the order in the cafe and leaving the waitress a generous tip. Weeks passed one after another, but there was no news from the private detective. All the while, Chiara took care of her former teacher, Vincent. She cooked his meals, washed his clothes, and even bought him new clothes to make him look decent. Ciara then began looking for a job for Vincent. Like a businesswoman, she called language schools, placed ads in newspapers, and told her acquaintances about him. Deep down, she couldn't bear to see such a talented man sitting idle. Of course, Chiara realized that it was difficult to find a job at such a ripe age, but she never gave up hope and persevered. Vincent, sensing her support, began to regain his strength. He was smiling more often now, and the sly sparkle in his eyes was back. "Thank you, Chiara. I don't know how I would have done it without you," he said at the table. "No way, Vincent. I'm glad I can help you," she replied. A few days later, Ciara found him a job teaching English at a small private school. "Well, congratulations. I'm so happy for you," she said as she offered to sign the employment contract. Vincent started working enthusiastically, sharing his knowledge and experience with the young staff. He was happy that he could be useful again. Ciara continued to support him, providing accommodation and helping him in times of need. One evening when Ciara returned home, she found Vincent looking at old photographs over a cup of tea. "What are you looking at?" she asked. "Just some pictures of my family. It's been so long since I've seen them," Vincent replied. "Are you not at all embarrassed by what your daughter has done? Have you forgiven her?" Ciara asked cautiously. "I'm not angry with her, Ciara," he said quietly. "She just didn't realize what she was doing. She was blind with pity. But I can't hate her for that," Vincent continued. "That's why I'm glad you came into my life. You gave me a second chance." Ciara smiled. She'd already realized that Vincent was a teacher from God who forgave his abusers generously. Instead of taking revenge, he chose to live with goodness in his heart. And at the beginning of the 3rd week, Andrew called to say that the exhumation had been settled. In addition, the detective promised to tell something truly stunning, but only later, when the issue with the removal of Eugene's coffin will be finally resolved. In truth, Ciara had been against the exhumation to the last minute, but when it did happen, she was in for a shock. Tearing off the lid of the expensive coffin, Billy saw that it was empty inside. That meant there had been no funeral. Or rather, it had taken place, but it had been staged. An empty coffin had been placed in the grave. Ciara almost lost her senses at the sight of it, and Andrew helped her calm down, and then came to the main thing. It turns out that he managed to find a financial trace of the stolen money. The funds were withdrawn to the accounts of foreign firms, but still could not go unnoticed. As it turned out later, Eugene for a long time had a mistress who lived abroad and came to the country only to settle the issues of his father's business. Vanessa was just preparing to enter into an inheritance whose roots had been in this country a long time ago. Her father, Nicky, had been forced to move abroad after his spouse died in childbirth. The boy was too young to move, and Nicky had urged his former classmate, Igor, to look after his son so he wouldn't end up in an orphanage. But things turned out differently. One day, Eden, who had become a sort of foster father to Nicky's son, couldn't bear the responsibility and left the boy at the cemetery when he was only 5 years old. It's hard to say why Eden did that. Perhaps he was simply exhausted. Or maybe he resented Nicky for stopping sending money to support the child. Either way, businessman Nicky Smolensky lost his son forever. It was rumored that for some time Nicky even tried to find his son, but it was all in vain. Subsequently, he started a new family and married a foreigner, Maggie, who gave birth to his daughter Vanessa. It was she who became the mistress of Eugene, who has long thought about running away abroad. However, to escape needed money, and a lot of money. That's when he looked for Chiara, who dragged her to the registry office. Already 6 months after meeting, listening to Andrew's story, Chiara could not believe her ears. God, had Claire been living in deceit all this time, she wondered. The private investigator sighed sadly and got to the point. It was Eugene who had disabled an important component in Chiara's car, causing it to drive off the bridge. His plan was for his wife to die in the accident. But when things went wrong, Eugene improvised on the fly and decided to pretend to be dead. In fact, he wasn't in the car at the time of the accident. And if it wasn't for the head injury that caused partial amnesia, Chiara would have remembered that she hadn't had time to pick up her husband on the highway. It would seem that the scoundrel had thought of everything, but he had not taken into account one thing, that among the crowd of passers-by there would be a man who would not be afraid to dive into the turbulent waters of the river after the car. Since then, Eugene had lost all peace of mind. Of course, he had organized his imaginary funeral and thought he was dead to everyone. But thoughts of Billy, who knew there was only a woman in the falling car, had kept him busy and prevented him from concentrating on his life overseas with Vanessa. Eugene searched for Billy for about a year before the foreign bounty hunters he hired picked up his trail in the city cemetery. They took the pleasure of visiting Eugene's empty grave. The next step was to give Billy a drink laced with poison. The foreigners left the cemetery with a clear conscience, except they miscalculated the dosage, or Billy really did have 9 lives. But he survived against all odds, and after the exhumation it was clear to everyone that Eugene was alive. He was immediately arrested at the request of the police. Such haste of foreign colleagues was by no means accidental. No one wanted such a sophisticated and cunning criminal to live in his country. Unfortunately, his mistress, Vanessa, was not even under investigation. After all, by and large, she did not appear anywhere and did not take an active part in the attempted assassination of Chiara. However, Vanessa was not particularly saddened by the arrest of her lover. The fact that just at this time she was preparing to enter the inheritance of her late father, Nicky Smolensky, whose life was taken by an insidious stroke. But the most interesting thing was ahead of her when Andrew was able to get in touch with Nicky's own son. To the surprise of many, he turned out to be an unknown drifter named Billy, who had almost recently been poisoned by 2 visiting gastronomes at the cemetery. To say that this news came as a shock to Billy is not to say anything. Tears flowed from the homeless man's eyes as he finally realized the meaning of his dream. After all, as a little boy, he had walked through the cemetery looking for his daddy, who he thought had abandoned him. But in fact, it wasn't his father, but a completely different man who Nicky had asked to look after his son. "So, what, I can be my father's heir now?" Billy asked, looking at Chiara. She shrugged, but then Andrew intervened. "Yes, Billy, you can. You just need to find a good family lawyer." Billy exhaled disappointedly. To tell the truth, he had hoped that everything would be amicable. A court case, and even overseas, seemed beyond his means. He doubted he could prove his claim to the inheritance. And did he really need the money when his father was gone? For days, Billy walked around depressed, but then Chiara offered to help. After Eugene's arrest, the businesswoman managed to recover all the stolen money. She decided to hire a capable lawyer for the former drifter, who became Jimmy. It was he who filed a lawsuit to contest the inheritance, so that Billy had a chance. A 1 in 100, 1,000, or even 1,000,000 chance, but a chance nonetheless. In the meantime, Chiara kept her promise and secured custody of little Alice. She immediately made an appointment with an orthopedist to find out the cause of her limp. As it became known after the examination, they had made the appointment in time. If they had delayed even a year, Alice could have remained terminally ill. But the little girl began accelerated rehabilitation in one of the best pediatric clinics, specializing in musculoskeletal injuries. Of course, Alice's stepfather tried several times to assert his custody rights, but after Noah went to the police, the scoundrel quickly realized what was at stake and disappeared from little Alice's horizon. Meanwhile, Billy was hard at work, preparing for the probate court in his dispute with Vanessa. Feeling their superiority, the foreign rich mocked the former vagrant, calling him a bum. Billy held on with all his might, not wanting to answer rudeness with rudeness. He couldn't imagine being able to offend a woman. On the day of the trial, only his lawyer believed in Billy's victory. Naturally, all the odds were on Vanessa's side, but Billy was going to go all the way, thanks largely to Albert Semyonovich's help. When he went to the microphone and, standing on a pedestal, began to talk about his life, the judge could not hold back tears. Despite Vanessa's taunts and wiggles, the jury saw before them not a grown man, but a little boy named Billy, who once looked for his father in the cemetery at dusk. The judge's decision shocked even seasoned lawyers. According to the verdict, Billy became the sole heir to the entire empire left by the late Nicky in Smolensk. As soon as it was announced, the hall exploded with applause. Many reporters who covered the process could not hold back tears, as well as Billy himself, who turned from an ugly duckling into a beautiful swan. But Billy did the chivalrous thing and gave half of the inheritance to his adversary, Vanessa. In his homeland, he was greeted as a hero with flowers and even champagne, with which he was poured from head to toe. Ciara and Alice stood in the front rows, eagerly awaiting his arrival. A little farther away were Noah and Andrew, without whom the event would not have taken place. The joy of those present was explained not only by the victory in court, but also by the fact that Billy had proposed to Ciara in public. How could he not? They had overcome so many obstacles together that they could now bind their hearts together. With champagne glasses clinking and guests shouting hallelujah, Ciara and Billy stood hand in hand, realizing that a new life full of happiness and understanding awaited them. After buying a bouquet of lilacs from the little girl, Oberon reluctantly shuffled home. Barely entering the apartment, she froze. Oberon was funny, such a sweet and cozy woman. Such cute, a little ridiculous individuals made her face involuntarily blurred into a smile. For some reason, it became immediately clear that before you a good-natured person who will not do meanness, will not betray, is not sick of dirt. Where did such confidence come from? Small height, dense build, hilarious redhead, all some kind of sunny, with a scattering of freckles, bright blue eyes, chubby pink cheeks. She walked on the ground a little lopsidedly, like a bear cub, a marvelous shade. People with this appearance from childhood teased red-haired clown. Oberon was not exempt from this fate. Having long since come to terms with such a bright appearance, it is characteristic that the mockery after the first acquaintance with a fiery red-haired girl, and then a girl and a woman, always stopped very quickly. Oberon conquered offenders with her naive directness, unwillingness to give a vicious rebuff in return. Why offend such a harmless creature? It was more pleasant to be friends with her. In this case, Mother Nature managed to award the girl a lot of dexterity in children's games. At school physical education classes, she did not lag behind her peers. Moreover, was the leader in many pranks in the kindergarten. It was Oberon took the little gang out of the territory through a gap in the fence, as the leader led the kids to the neighboring garages, where the bravest were offered to test the ride of courage. The rules were simple: climb to the roof of one of the garages on a rickety and someone forgotten at the gate ladder. Then you go to the garage closest to the children's institution, from which you jump into the sandbox standing by the fence. So that the friendly team was not afraid, the first to do all these simple manipulations, Oberon. In a minute, her ringing voice, already encouraging, was heard from the platform behind the swings. Let's be quiet, or Kira Swan will notice. Everyone climbed, crossed, and jumped, except for Kieran, who was long and skinny. He'd always been a bit of an outlier in their older group. Why on earth had he even gotten into this adventure in the first place? Accepting the jumpers, Oberon seated them on a bench. While the teacher was chatting with her colleague about something, Oberon went to the eye again. The confused Kiran was shuffling from foot to foot at the garage, not daring to step on the bottom step of the fragile ladder. "Give me your hand, I'll take the first one, and you follow me," said Oberon. From the garage, too, jumped off with a strong duet. Hand in hand, with briefcases later, they went to the same first grade. The irredeemable ones, the little bully Auberine and the unintelligent Kieran. She dragged him along with her in all her mischief. They walk from school past the fountain near the plant office, the furniture factory. September is still hot in their southern town, and they are tired after school. Why not cheer up? At home, Auberine has only an old grandmother. She won't notice they're both wearing their school uniforms. Jump over the edge to where the water's up to their waists. Gracious coolness, tight jets of water falling from above. It's great, especially since Kieran's mom has no time to take care of him. For months he was in the care of a nanny, always trying to escape to the house of a girlfriend, where cozy smells, delicious buns and cherry compote. A 3-liter jar with this sweet delicacy is never outnumbered here. They come quietly in wet clothes. Kieran even had an old tracksuit to change into. And they would come to their grandmother were hungry, were exhausted. So they grew up in this modest old-fashioned apartment with carpets on the walls, crystal on the shelves, an empty chest of drawers with thick fluffy plaids, in which they wrapped themselves in winter, the two of them to watch their favorite cartoons about Tom and Jerry on TV. Auberine's parents were oilmen who spent their whole life somewhere near a drilling rig, designing it themselves, then controlling whether there were any failures in its work. They would go to their daughter's house for a couple of summer months, and then all together they would go to the Black Sea. It takes only 5 hours to drive from them to the coast. It's a paradise there. The salty reservoir rolled on the sand or pebbles with foamy waves. The sun covered my skin with bronze tan. Palm trees and magnolias glistened with foliage. The last representatives of tropical flora also dizzy their heads with the sweet, fragrant aroma of their white, graceful flowers. There was even an amusing incident in their family. One evening, while everyone in the boarding house was at a dance, Auberine's father, Vincent, climbed a tree and plucked a fragile magnolia flower for his wife. In the room, they put it in a water pitcher. It's a good thing the maid stopped by before they went to bed to see if they needed anything. "You're out of your minds, dear guests," she gasped. "It is good if you just have a headache from this insidious plant. And there are cases of people with allergies, which reaches anaphylactic shock." One tourist, the same fan of romance and magnolias, from us once barely managed to get to the hospital. Without waiting for objections, the maid quickly picked up the jug of already fading beauty and took it to the balcony. "That's where you go and admire it," she grumbled. "I'll bring you another container for drinking water. What do you think you're doing, poisoning yourselves here in our institution?" The next day, Vincent dutifully went to the local market and brought his red-haired wife a bunch of large daisies and a large watermelon with thick black seeds and bright red, juicy flesh. The incident was exhausted, and the new experience was recorded for the future. By the way, Auberine had been born such a pretty redhead for a reason. She was a smaller version of her mother, Stacy, a carbon copy of herself. Vincent, who had come to the windows of the hospital on the day of Auberine's birth, couldn't contain his emotions. "Yes, Stacy, you're obviously two golden red-haired creatures in one family. It's a treasure trove. There's a reason you were so toxic the whole pregnancy. Our daughter could braid her hair out of that fire fleece." When in her childhood, after watching a cartoon about a red-headed redhead tried to start complexes because of her hair color, Stacy stopped them once and for all. "Daughter, take a good look at me," Stacy said. "Has my hair the color of shiny copper ever hindered me in life? My red locks, like a generous sun, kissed on the top of my head. You're always on display, always bright and always happy. Your life, too, will be, if not a constant celebration, then certainly not a boring everyday. Believe in yourself, Abby. Appearance is a shell. I wish you had a heart of gold. Good people get back 100-fold the warmth they give, even if they forget the good deeds themselves." Auberine remembered her mother's words from that time. It was as if she had stamped on a metal surface an inscription dear to her heart, the kind of engraving one usually writes on commemorative gifts. She loved her parents fanatically, despite the fact that she had seen little of them. And now her now gray-haired enthusiasts, Vincent and Stacy, were away working on new drilling technology. How many young engineers are there around? And no, if something complicated is being implemented in a distant enterprise, Vincent and Stacy are as good as gone. Aubrey thought. She had long since gotten used to their long absences, having learned to be quite independent after her grandmother's death. She'd gotten married early, almost right out of high school. A young married lady is not a big deal. You have to live up to your status. Aubrey's husband was that childhood and youthful friend, the unforgettable Kieran. They had been so used to being inseparable since kindergarten that their marriage was taken for granted. Love is different, isn't it? Some people build relationships on the flames of passion, while others spend a long time choosing, courting, and pursuing the object of their desire. Kieran and Abby had another version, which is usually called love friendship. It seems that no one sighs for anyone. Under the moon on the bench stars do not admire. Candy and bouquets in the heart does not carry. But it was astonishing that such a phenomenon could be written down in the new medical discoveries. It became difficult for Kieran to breathe without Abby, and panic appeared. Abby had to know every minute what was going on with Kieran, what her heartfelt friend was doing. Kieran seemed to really need help, or at least a kind word of approval from Aubrey. But she wasn't around. They both did evenly in school, no brilliant successes, but no embarrassing failures either. After receiving his diploma, Kieran wisely decided not to go to the local technical university, which trained tamers of computer hardware. Instead, he chose a down-to-earth profession installing smart machines, connect everything intelligently, fill them with optimal stuffing. The basics of this profession began to pop out at him already by the end of the first year. Which of his friends or neighbors to help with a laptop or desktop PC? He never said no. Soon the neighborhood was posted ads I install and configure computers, inexpensive with his home phone number. He and Kieran had a long laugh that Kira's grandmother now had to be paid a salary to act as a silent dispatcher. She answered the phone, recording the client's details. By evening, the list of those wishing to use the services of the young master was already ready. Surprisingly, there were many orders for installation and connection. Soon Kieran and Oberyn could afford frequent trips to their favorite pastry shop with divinely delicious cakes and coffee. By the winter session, they had accumulated a sum of money in their unexpected expenses piggy bank. It would be enough for their common beautiful dream to see St. Petersburg in all its glory. Both of their parents were away for long periods of time, so Kieran didn't need to come home after class. He worked in the improvised workshop they had built in the apartment, coming only at night. His mother took care of her son's upbringing strictly by phone at 22 at check call. Kier, are you all right? Eating regularly, preparing for the session. Yes, Mom, everything is fine, he answered. A theatrical pause followed. Then I can work in peace. I've got a lot on my plate. And Kieran's mom would disappear again with the dial tone. He sometimes didn't even know in which city his mom was shining on the stage at that moment. Oberyn and his grandparents, as she affectionately called them, were no less punctilious. Their interrogation was usually meticulous, but it was Vincent's grandmother, not Aubrey, who peppered them with questions. She reported cheerfully that everything was going according to plan, that her granddaughter had passed her credits and exams on time, without arrears. And now the girl was going with Kieran to the northern capital. Even airplane tickets have already been bought. After the conversation with her grandmother, Stacy and Vincent looked at each other. Don't even get me started, the man said. They're both 18 now. Kieran is a decent guy. I trust him. He would never hurt our girl. Auberyn has chosen a very interesting profession for herself, organizer of festive events, specialization event manager. Lucky that there is such a faculty right in their city, at the Federal University. It is called, however, ornate crowdsourcing and event management. But the group was excellent. The guys and girls were all creative individuals. A month after the beginning of the classes, they were already having fun at the kapustnik, singing in the choir, learning national dances, learning the science of stage craftsmanship, and studying the psychology of influencing hearts. Abi did not just come home from school, but flew on wings, joyfully sharing all her achievements with her grandmother and Kiran. So both of them passed the session without any problems. Abi and Kiran flew to Peter, a city that was both majestic and silent from the heavy frost, at lunchtime. After settling into their room, they immediately rushed to the Georgian cafe in the building across the street. Khachapuri with cheese, khinkali filled with minced meat, hot juice and spicy Abkhazian snacks. Everything was unusual, and therefore delicious. They ordered themselves a glass of red wine like adults. Now it seemed to them that they were not students, but solid, experienced men and women. Next, everything happened rapidly. They came out of the friend zone, barely returning to the room. They had fallen asleep in each other's arms 1,000 times before in the evening to the peaceful hum of the television, always hugging each other in a friendly way when meeting and parting, kissing each other on the cheek, touching their lips to each other's foreheads if there was a suspicion of fever. There were no vibes, no chemistry, which seemed to appear at such close communication of young people. And they had never in all that time fallen in love with any of their peers on the side. Among their classmates, they were an unspoken couple, only together, only next to each other. All the gossip had bypassed them, but their hormones were dormant, not pushing them to sensual actions. Here in St. Petersburg, they, inexperienced, young, heated by wine and impressions, became close so naturally, as if they had already entered heaven. The full moon smiled, winking at the shining stars. Young people, may the heavens grant you personal happiness. Abi and Kiran, engrossed in each other, did not hear the moon's whisper. And was there one? Maybe the wind and snow had dreamed it all on that magical St. Petersburg evening. The trip to northern Palmyra was a revelation for the guys in many ways. They lived in a miniature hotel on Maratha Street, a few meters from Nevsky Prospect. The temperature outside the window was increasingly dropping to -15 degrees Celsius. There was an additional cold and dampness from the numerous reservoirs. The snow crunched underfoot. We didn't walk for a long time. We saved ourselves in cafes. We took several cups of different teas, arguing which spices gave it a particularly memorable flavor. Sometimes we had a couple of shots of sweet liqueur or mulled wine. For dinner, we brought sweets to the room. From the cafe candy shop again, they piled tea or coffee and enjoyed socializing. The romantic journey flashed by like a single day. They returned home, as always, holding hands. Peter had won their hearts forever and bonded them together even more tightly. A month later, Abi felt distinctly sick. She felt nauseous in the mornings when her grandmother baked pancakes for breakfast, and in the evenings when she cooked pasta patties for her. Stacy was far away from her daughter at that moment. Abi was certainly not a naive little girl. She had long ago bought a pregnancy test from the drugstore that showed the coveted 2 stripes. She broke the news to Kiran, who immediately reassured her. "I know, my dear. How do you end up so close to the opposite sex?" Oberon asked. "My mother won't be home for 2 months. She has another tour. I don't intend to wait for her consent. Kiran and I have decided to get married. Make sure you tell her. We'll apply tomorrow. We'll be officially married in a month. Our baby must have a father and a mother. The decision is not open for discussion." "You, Kiran, make it simple," she said. "Where will we live, and with what money?" "It's nothing," he replied. "My mother is in a common law marriage with a new man, travels with him in cities. Then he takes her to resorts to rest. The apartment is completely at our disposal. When the deadline comes, he'll take a sabbatical. I've already gotten used to the orders. Word of mouth works. Some clients recommend me to others. I've also prepared a new batch of ads with a different contact number." Mother Kiran, actress Rose Arnold, though she was a supporting actress in the local theater, but on tour in the reserve cast went always with great pleasure. And Kieran's fathers were constantly changing. A lot of husbands, a lot of passions, so necessary for a creative person. Otherwise, how to play love on stage. In the affairs of her grown-up son, she as long ago did not interfere, almost stopped the daily evening interrogations. Rose firmly adhered to the position bad news finds people. If it is still quiet, then everything goes its way. The last man Rose was from the theater commercial circles and suited her most of all with his generosity. To be fair, outwardly Rose Arnold in her 50s was still very good-looking. Over 40 years old in the evening light, as she herself joked. Even detractors had nothing to say. The well-groomed coquette was already a little over 50, but she did not lift anything heavier than cutlery. She was helped by her housekeeper and her son's nanny. What an enviable life. Official marriages in the passport Rose Arnold was 3 pieces, but unofficial romances she had not countless. And who needs that boring arithmetic when it comes to Rose? She had one specialty: she could sing romances in a thick, low voice. Although she did not learn vocals and did not learn, but will raise to the sky large languid eyes with skillfully lined black pencil eyelashes, slightly raised in a graceful question eyebrow, open sensual full lips and draggy told me be you mine and I will live. Passion burning. Another man with a delicate mental organization fell into the net set Rose. Looked at her like a rabbit on a boa constrictor, hurried to fulfill any of her whims, opened access to his accounts and cash. Rose wasted no time, pampered herself, her favorite, as much as she could, knowing that she could not keep her lover for long. She had an empty, boring soul. God had hurt her intellect. But she herself considered further mental development as an empty occupation. She could not hold a conversation in a decent society. She was more silent, parading around the hall and showing another flashy outfit. Men with money are often not fools. They quickly lost interest in her and disappeared from her horizon. The trouble was that Rose, like any man, inexorably aged. Not every worthy and rich fish is no longer caught in her predatorily arranged nets. She did not want to look at the smaller specimens, carefully watched her behavior and words to keep her partner longer. And this time she did not let go of her young lover, even for a moment. Men were becoming fewer and fewer, and age was getting scarier. Vincent and Stacy took the news of Auberine's imminent marriage and pregnancy to heart. They agreed to celebrate the wedding in the summer during a vacation, when they will be in their hometown, and Rose Arnold will have a break in the tour schedule. The young people were now leading a shared family life for 2 homes. After university classes, Oberyn and Kieran would go to their grandmother's house for lunch, and then go to Kieran's apartment. The boy would again fiddle with another order at home, or go out on a call. Oberyn was preparing for her seminars, running an unpretentious household. She began to take lessons from her grandmother, a skilled cook, and soon she could cook something simple for herself and her young husband. In the registry office, they were signed a month after the application was submitted. The newlyweds joked, remembering a quote from the old Soviet movie Girls With a Family: Kieran, husband and wife. "You can die laughing." And they both started laughing. Young and green, everything still seemed so magical, serenely joyful. Parents on both sides did not interfere in their life together, hoping for the prudence of children. Grandmother looked after from afar. She bought her granddaughter fruit, so that in her interesting position the body received vitamins, then gave her now legitimate grandson Kieran a warm scarf, so that he did not catch a cold running on calls throughout the neighborhood. Already spring has powerfully entered its rites. The end of April. When she opened the window, a floral scent wafted through the apartment. In their southern city, there were so many lilacs, garden, Persian, and wild. For as long as Oberyn and Kieran could remember, they had associated spring with the fluffy white and purple flowers on the branches of the shrubbery, and with bunches of blooming lilacs in the house, arranged in vases. By the May holidays, there was a general restlessness at the university at Oberyn's. There were several reasons for this. The practical exams were just around the corner. at which the students would show their acquired skills on the institute's scaffolding in the large assembly hall. The noisy competition of numbers was attended by representatives of advertising, entertainment agencies, workers of show business, movie industry, experts from television, including one of the presenters of the Central TV channel. During a program devoted to dating, one of the presenters once said worthy suitors are still puppies, and it was much the same with the Oberon students. There were only a few really talented guys for the whole stream. Experienced producers had to keep their ears open in order not to miss a diamond that could be earned in the future. Here you could get a job, get someone's attention for a prospect, and participate in casting. By the time the performances began, Auberyn's tummy had already rounded out a bit, but to avoid drawing attention with her interesting situation, she chose the role of a red-headed clown for a defense number. Spacious bright green jumpsuit, yellow shirt with a brown checkered pattern. There was almost no makeup on her face, just a plastic tube nose, some mascara on her eyes and lip gloss. Her copper hair didn't even need to be specially styled frizzy swirls stuck out in all directions, as the image demanded. The committee unanimously gave Oberon an excellent for a successful reprise. As she sat down in the auditorium to catch her breath and watch her fellow students perform, a man in an expensive suit and bright pink shirt approached her. "Hello, Oberon. I enjoyed your number. I would like to invite you to perform at our corporate event." "Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Andrei Vladimirovich. The details of our cooperation, if you agree, we'll discuss later." The bewildered Oberon didn't even have time to reply as the man disappeared somewhere. She feverishly thought that this couldn't be, because it could never be. She had created her clowned carrot top not for the public, but for herself, putting into his facial expressions and gestures a part of her cheerful soul. She did not expect that her experimental image could seriously appeal to anyone. At that moment, her buddy Milachka plopped into the seat next to Auberyn. "Abi, don't you get it?" she exclaimed. "The great and terrible Andrew Smolyakov himself just sat next to you. His modeling agency, Aphrodite's Favor, has girls from all over our county signing up for auditions 6 months in advance. Do you know how he was nicknamed in bohemian circles? Janie." "Who? Why Janie?" Mila shrugged, just jealous of his success. "His nickname is the 3 R's, which means dude, dodger, and dodger. He is an excellent swindler, but what a pro. He's got a diamond in the rough. If he spotted someone in the crowd, expect a brilliant career in the modeling business, defile on the world's catwalks, fame and fans. What kind of questions would he have for you? You're a mother, you're not in the trend, and you're pregnant. Is Andrew losing his business acumen?" Auberon didn't know what to say to this agitated speech. A void in her mind. She was more concerned about why Kieran hadn't returned her phone call. She was so eager to share with him that she passed the credit she dreaded with a yay. At the same time, Andrew, to whom Mila had just sung praises, was sharing a new idea with his assistant. "I found a unique person, a young lady performing a skit with a red-haired clown. It will be a furor when we release her on our stage. The contrast between natural beauty and nature's jokes on her appearance. Have you seen this person? She's a walking misunderstanding. But she's a sweetheart, a mix of red hair and spontaneity. What kind of person would take her place? The other one would have burned with shame and complexes, but this one doesn't. Apparently she lives with her head held high. I even saw a wedding ring on her hand. Found a lover of such ugliness." And Andrew, very pleased with his caustic humor, laughed. It was good that the naive Abi did not hear his words. Although who knows, maybe Andrew's words would have hurt Auberyn, but would have saved her from a great misfortune. Andrew's assistant found the young woman the very next day. The background information was as follows: a famous modeling agency was planning another show. Auberyn's task as a red-haired clown was to entertain the audience in the pauses when the models from Andrew's agency would be changed into the next outfits from the collection of a local designer. The action was to take place in a fashionable hotel, stylized as a medieval Gothic castle. All the capital's bowmen was to gather at this outlandish performance. Oberon, who for participation in the show was offered a fabulous fee by student standards, was not afraid of the stage and the audience in a huge hall with velvet armchairs. But the hotel complex itself struck her at first sight with its mysterious atmosphere. With her exuberant imagination, she immediately imagined nightly tournaments, beautiful ladies in lavish dresses, balls, intrigue and unearthly love of imaginary heroes. Oberon did not move through the halls like a bear this time. She had even muted that ability. She walked like a fairy with a magic wand in her hands, mentally touching people and objects, immersing them in the fairy tale that was already being born in her head. On the improvised catwalk, everything happened exactly as Andrew had planned. The fashion collection was done in black and white colors. It had a cold, sharp, steely sheen. When a red-haired clown appeared on stage during the breaks, the difference in theme was so great that everyone involuntarily admired again the talent of the young clothing designer and his innovative views on how femme fatale should look like. The intended effect was 100% realized. Oberon, inspired by her successful performances in front of so many people, decided to have a little snack. A buffet was set up in the lobby bar. The mom-to-be put a couple of canopies on a miniature plate, took a glass of lemonade from the tray and sat down in a secluded place on a soft sofa. After a couple of minutes, she heard muffled voices. In one of them, she recognized the commanding tone of her local patron. "Joshua, have you seen those ginger ugly things?" "Poor girl," someone said. "You don't often see such a hopeless case of total lack of beauty. You are the very creator of female goddesses, to whom you give long, slender legs, to whom you give deep, expressive eyes. And who will you give a luxurious hair? Can you believe she has a wedding ring on her hand? I can't even imagine a man who could sleep with her of his own free will." Oberon dropped the canapé from her hands. Andrew, a well-known person in the city, philanthropist, businessman, owner of the realm of female beauty, said all this with such contempt, as if he were talking about some disgusting insect. "You see such an ugly thing, you want to step on it and crush it." All of Stacy's words about the special charm of redheads were instantly forgotten. In her head, as if in a cramped cage, her thoughts rattled. The program is over. I don't want to wait for any honorarium. Get out of here. Out now. Oberon ran out of the lobby bar and immediately ran into the two men talking with glasses of cognac in their hands. "Damn, Andrew, your stage vis-a-vis just heard us talking," one of them said. "Hold her and calm her down." But it was no longer possible to hold Oberon, who was rushing forward. She started rapidly down the narrow spiral staircase to the first floor. The wrought iron railings beneath the smooth, shiny handrails were all decorated with graceful roses, so skillfully crafted that they were indistinguishable from real flowers of royalty, with buds, leaves, and thorns blooming. Near the next flight of stairs, the wide pants of his stage costume caught on one of the sharp metal branches below. The red-haired clown was still running desperately downward, but the sturdy fabric was already caught on the metal. Oberon flailed her arms ridiculously in the air, and like a puppet, she was hung from the treacherous piece of jewelry. The last thing she felt before she lost consciousness was multiple jabs of something hard in her chest, stomach, and legs. Drops of blood instantly began to appear on the steps. As the crowd rushed to the scene, the picture was gruesome. Hanging from the metal rose pattern under the railing was a bright redhead named Oberon. Only now she wasn't laughing at all, nor was she uttering funny phrases in a ringing voice. She was bleeding, and no one would ever know that a few minutes ago the heart and soul of this young woman had been bleeding, just like that. The ambulance arrived quickly. By then the hotel guards had already pushed the curious away from the scene of the accident. They were afraid to take Oberon down the stairs without medical intervention. The sight was horrific. Local paparazzi were sneakily clicking their phones, trying to get sensational facts that could then be sold to the media and the yellow press. There were many amateurs before the media. Someone was rubbing his hands together, rather rubbing his hands that Andrew was proud of it, and now it would take a long time to wash off. After such an incident, his reputation will be tarnished, and the whole business may be shaken if it turns out the racy background of what happened. Everyone was curious to the point of goosebumps. What pushed this handsome red-haired clown to run like Cinderella, whose time is running out at? At the hospital, Oberon went straight to the operating table. The baby could not be saved. Andrew, who learned that the red-headed clown he had hired was pregnant, grabbed his head. He had a long talk with Joshua, whom he persuaded to keep quiet if they were called to the police as witnesses to that violent conversation. The modeling agency had paid in full for Oberon's stay in a private room, where now and then throughout the day couriers came by with baskets of fruit, juices, chicken broth, and then other meals from the best restaurants in town. To meet with him, Oberon refused flatly. Only his assistant was allowed to enter the room, who brought a fee and an impressive bonus, ostensibly for the inconvenience caused. The already recovering young woman said to the employee Andrew, "As cut off, don't let your boss shake with fear." "No one will ever know the true cause of my fall down the stairs," Oberon said. "Tell him that verbatim. I'll take the money. Why not? But he's the one buying the silence. I'm the one who thought I'd done my pay and allowance honestly. This is the end of our cooperation. I no longer wish to see anyone who has the slightest connection to Aphrodite's favor. Consider it a gesture of my goodwill." The aide conveyed what the chief had said verbatim. She even thought she heard a sigh of relief. It's a dark story, she thought to herself, but she didn't say anything like that out loud. She had been working with Smolyakov for a long time. She'd seen a lot of things around his controversial business. Kieran had been by Oberon's side ever since his wife and baby had suffered that terrible accident. He had even brought their old stove from home, where they liked to cook together. He covered it and prayed over the blanket. There were bunches of lilac flowers everywhere in the ward. Its sweet fragrance always knew how to lift the mood of the red-haired clown. A few days later, earlier than usual, Oberon's parents, Stacy, flew in from the north. She spoke at length with the doctor about the future possibilities of motherhood for her daughter. The doctor reassured her. 3 years with the baby would have to wait. The operation was serious, but we managed to preserve all childbearing functions. Oberon has lost a lot of blood. She's very weak now. Let her finish her studies in peace, get her diploma, and then we can think about the continuation of the family again. Rose obviously did not consider it her duty to come to at least morally support her son's young family. She took the news of the loss of her grandson with enthusiasm. "Kieran, don't let it go to waste," she said. "This child was too early a decision for you. You've only just turned 19. What kind of father are you? You've got a lot of snot to wipe off." Kieran was mentally glad his wife couldn't hear their dialogue. The memories of their loss and the tragedy that had played out in the marvelous Gothic hotel were too sad for Oberon. Oberon did not tell her husband about the conversation she had accidentally witnessed. She was released from the hospital and went to her studies. She avidly attended lectures and practical classes. Only she never wanted to wear her red-haired clown outfit again, no matter how her teachers and fellow students asked her to do so. After the summer session, Kieran, Oberon, and her parents went to the seaside together by car. Vincent loved to drive his old BMW. What did he call it? It was old, but it was old. But it was a beast. Nothing had happened to it because at the time it had been sitting in the garage. On vacation, they traveled everywhere they could. They lived in a small village, in one of the new hotels on the beachfront. You go out on the loggia in the room downstairs, 20 meters away. The sea is splashing. Behind the fence, there was a park where the hotel guests could disappear as much as they wanted, and even for free. There was a small grove of pomegranate trees near the monument to Pushkin. Excursions were always wandering around the park itself, so Kieran and Oberon hid in a corner above the sea, next to the son of Russian poetry Alex. Here the young woman turned into the host of some holiday they had invented. Kiran became a kind spectator and in the ninth row. Who still remembers the unique creative legacy of Archie will immediately understand what we are talking about. In the evening, the rehearsed performance was shown to the parents, and there was not among the audience more grateful listeners. Oberyn gradually withdrew. They spent a long time together splashing in the sea, and then went to the local market to buy amazing grapes, peaches, tart homemade wine. In the evening we had dinner on the loggia, and admired the marvelous moment when the orange ball of the sun kissed the emerald surface of the sea. Sunsets there were always fabulously beautiful. The clouds became pink, and the soul sang, flew somewhere upwards. Several times the whole family took a ride to the city. There on the quay another funny story happened to Oberyn. Rather intrusive photographer with some animal on his shoulder insistently stretched out his hands to the red-haired woman and shouted. The animal turned out to be a chinchilla, which at once tangibly pulled Oberyn's finger, then posed in her arms like a model, and did not want to let her go. The photographer, very surprised by the behavior of his assistant, thoughtfully said, "Mayabi's instincts are impeccable. She recognizes good people with a pure heart from a mile away." The photographer didn't even understand why the family was laughing at first. Vincent eagerly explained, "You've just taken a picture of your namesakes, your Obby and our Oberyn. I noticed from a distance." He and Kieran hugged their companions by the shoulders and they continued their walk along the picturesque promenade. This vacation was one of the most memorable events in Oberyn's life. And then grief came to the house. Vincent's mother had died. She quietly went to heaven in her sleep. The empty apartment no longer smelled of freshly baked goods. Only the shelves of the pantry still held jars of cherry compote. True to tradition, the quiet, cultured grandmother Oberyn had managed to prepare this summer season's favorite supplies. Folk wisdom says trouble doesn't come alone. It brings. The next 6 months after the death of Grandma, tragedy happened to the beautiful Rose Arnold. The accident was trivial. The actress did not want to part with high heels, even on winter boots. In a rare for the southern city period of ice, she slipped right on the tiny edge of the steps leading to the entrance. Rose took an unfortunate fall and broke her infamous femoral neck. Kieran had just turned in another winter session at the time. After his grandmother left, he and Janie had moved back into the apartment of Auburn's young parents. It had always seemed more familiar to them. And then, with a surprise from her mother, Auburn ran to the hospital to see Rose as if it were work. Her second mom turned out to be an extremely capricious woman. Kira Swan secretly left on the pretense of a touring emergency. It was as if she'd never been there. Kieran disappeared in the morning at the university, and then ran on the orders of his mother after the operation, which promised that she would be able to walk again after the injury. The ward and comforts were costly for the youth. Finally, after a couple months on hospital duty, all those expensive delicacies from the stores, morsels, specialty coffees, teas, and desserts, Rose Arnold was transported home with pomp, as if to the sound of an invisible orchestra, and settled on a disassembled sofa. Already on the way she sang Oberyn, either an ode to her daughter or a romance about her love for her daughter-in-law, with a mute plea in her eyes not to abandon her in such trouble. Kieran and Oberyn went to live with Rose Arnold. Just a year after that tragedy with the red-haired clown. Outside the window, the fragrant lilacs were blooming again. Oberyn hoped that soon her mother-in-law would recover, and she and Kieran would live their old life again. A whole year passed in labor and care for Rose Arnold. The young woman rolled her grocery cart between the aisles at the supermarket and thought to herself, "Rose's mom loves cranberry morsels. We're just out of it, and I've got to find a tea bag of chrysanthemum. They say it lowers blood pressure when it's cold. With her fracture, we don't need hypertension coming out. It's all coming from nerves." I happy, carefree living with her son Kieran, and she, at her elegant age, does not need unnecessary troubles. Oberyn's confidence has been boosted in recent months by a big change in her creative field. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Once she was rushing home after classes at the university to quickly tell her husband what topic she got in her thesis, and almost knocked down some young woman. I turned around to apologize. And it turned out to be Polyakov's assistant who had brought her honorarium to the hospital. Abby wanted to get away. The memories associated with Aphrodite's favor were too painful, but that was not to be. Smolyakov's right hand grabbed her by the sleeve of her jacket and said, "You're just what I need. I was going to look for you. And here you yourself showed up." The woman smiled warmly and continued, "You've played a part in my career. It's up to you to clean up the mess." After the accident with the red-haired clown, I could no longer work with Andrew. I felt in my gut that he had a hand in the tragedy with you. I've known his partner Joshua a long time, so it wasn't hard for me to get him to talk and find out the truth. I couldn't look at the chief without contempt after those revelations, and Adam was pretty famous in modeling circles. I quit under a plausible pretext. Soon I found a new place, cleaner, more decent. I'm now in charge of children's parties, running my own company. My business is booming. Now I myself need an assistant with a golden, untainted heart like yours. Let's try to work together. The clouds seemed to part and the sun shone brightly around her. She had always secretly dreamed of working with children. The younger generation would never discuss her appearance. They would just enjoy the show. For a new part-time job took up with great enthusiasm. Reprisals in the play with the participation of puppets, Rostovi marionettes, a collection of colorful decorations in the entertainment office on the initiative's Oberon not spared funds. All the more. All expenses quickly paid off, she continued to generate ideas. Only the request to return to the stage red-haired clown resolutely and uncompromisingly always rejected. She had almost no time for Kieran now. But he didn't take offense. He himself disappeared somewhere for days and evenings. He came home happy. Now they could afford to pamper poor, unhappy, sick Rose with more treats, new silk pajamas with luxurious lace, elite grapes, wine, which Rose used to treat her nerves. After the operation was a year, but the promises of doctors had not yet come true. Rose Arnold did not leave the sofa, to which Janie all the time carried trays with the next wishes of her mother-in-law. The woman was clearly not suffering from a lack of appetite or requests. At the bus stop near her mother-in-law's house, Oberon saw a girl carrying fragrant lilac branches. The purple, fragrant flowers looked a little sad. They wanted to drink, to be in a moist environment. But passers-by were bustling past on their own. No one was going to buy lilacs. "How much do you want for spring happiness?" Oberon asked the young saleswoman with a smile. "How much would you give for a date with spring?" The girl cheerfully picked up the game. Oberon, who had just today received a fee for another series of birthdays, was generous, taking out a $1,000 bill from her purse. After thinking about it, she added a large Belgian chocolate bar. She was treated to it today by one of the moms of the kids who were guests at the children's party. The girl did not break down and gladly took both gifts. She tried to give Oberon the whole set of obviously barbarously broken lilac branches. The woman gave the young flower seller another warm smile and gave her a final pep talk. "Soon people will start coming back from the day shift. A lot of people like lilacs. You'll sell all you can get in no time. And I'll have enough for this many branches. Good luck, my friend." The rest of the way to the apartment, Oberon kept bringing lilacs to her nose. Her snub nose greedily inhaled the sense of spring's awakening to life. How fortunate that today's holiday had been moved 2 hours earlier. She was able to free herself at an unscheduled time. Now she would put the dough for the cookies of her grandmother's famous delicious scones. She'll probably have time to boil some borscht too. She hadn't spoiled Kieran with a home-cooked meal in a long time. Both of them had no time. They sat on half-finished products. Only Rose Arnoldovna, who had been ill for a long time, drank fresh, strong broths. She's a sick person. She's supposed to be on the payroll. I tried to open the door to the apartment quietly. Her mother-in-law liked to take a nap during the day. Why bother her? On the threshold, she froze when she heard the ringing voice of her second mother, not pitiful as usual. Bella, my dear friend. That's me. All on the main roles in the theater did not take. But in vain in me died a great actress. For 6 months I've been playing that nasty Oberon by the nose, and she doesn't know a thing. Oberon turned into a mute question. Guess what? Rose Arnold was on the phone with her pal, a makeup artist from their theater, a talented actress. You know, we paid for the surgery back then. Well, I'm back on my feet, but I can only walk around the apartment with a stick. And that's only when I'm home alone. Auberine, although my sister-in-law is easygoing. I just got a job. I'm about to graduate. Hunt will be looking after me so diligently. Even then, she continued, flicking her lighter and lighting another cigarette. Oh, how good it is that this is not a crypt. Red-haired Berzina didn't give me a grandchild then. As I imagine that now there would be one more of the same ugly redhead walking around the apartment, my heart would go straight down. How my Kieran started earning good money. Wouldn't you recognize him? He's grown up. He's handsome. It's not the kind of woman who should be his date now. Oh, you don't know our big news yet. Kieran's finally met a beautiful girl and he's going out with her, soaring on the wings of love. No, I haven't seen her in person yet, but my boy has been bringing me photos of them together on his phone. She's a goddess. She's got a good face. She's beautifully built. No wonder Kieran lost his head. I gave them the keys to my country house. My son and daughter-in-law didn't know about my third husband's inheritance. I kept a mansion in the suburbs for myself for a rainy day. But seeing how Kieran is in love with this lovely creature, I could not resist at the sight of imposed on him a stupid pregnancy wife. His eyes never burned. Auberine sat down on the grocery bags just down the hallway. Everything swam in front of Oberon's eyes, a ball of fire growing in her head, ready to burst into shards of pain. It's not true, her heart screamed, and her mind, unwilling to give in to her emotions, immediately began to toss in bits of strange inconsistencies, titillating them with the strangeness of her memories. Here she was walking Kieran to work, and suddenly she smelled the unfamiliar, tart odor of perfume from him. And here they are at the mall, and he declares to her that he is tired of walking in cheap socks from the collection of 10 years ago. He pulls her into an expensive men's clothing boutique, where they buy him stylish jeans. As recently as the day before yesterday, he returned from a late job and flatly refused to eat dinner. He explained that he was so hungry that on his way home he went to a cafe and ate there. He had never gone to a catering establishment without his wife before. They had been together all their lives since kindergarten and trusted each other so much that it had never even occurred to Auberine that her childhood friend, classmate, and husband could go out, get involved with someone, or have a mistress. Oberon suddenly froze. After all, citing fatigue, he had not shared a bed with her for over a month. Is it really true what her mother-in-law is now happily telling her girlfriend? People react to stress in different ways. Someone immediately rushes into battle to reclaim their position. Some people drown their sorrows with wine and sedatives. Oberon was neither one of those two types. She was leaving the lives of people who once meant a lot to her forever, without finding out anything, without proving anything to anyone. That's how it was after the story with the red-headed clown. It would be like that now. Oberon had never had much respect for Rose Arnoldovna. She had only courted her because of her warm regard for Kieran. Now she wondered feverishly, did she truly love her husband? Or had their love, born then in St. Petersburg on the basis of a strong friendship, always been a deception, an illusion, an attempt of two lonely hearts to find happiness? Now she somehow did not know the exact answer to this question. Kieran had always been there for her. They had always been inseparable since childhood. What is passion that burns everything in its path? Oberon probably didn't know. She still hadn't lost the ability to find excuses for her unexpected friend in every situation. Or perhaps that aged complex that she was utterly devoid of feminine appeal had risen to the surface again to plunge her into a new abyss of doubt. Now she would quickly find the keys to her grandmother's apartment in a drawer and go there to heal her mental wounds. In a month, her parents would arrive from up north. She shouldn't say anything to them yet about her life changing so drastically. Kieran really was in love. He was in love. Tana was one of his clients. A first-year student, she was in a big city for the first time, where her parents had rented her an apartment. She couldn't figure out the latest model laptop on her own without her elders. Kieran, who had recently turned 21, seemed very big and mature compared to the 18-year-old fragile girl. He was about to defend his diploma, and here was a freshman. While he was dealing with her machine, she brewed him a wonderful coffee, made a mountain of delicious sandwiches, and all the while she was seen hovering around him like a light bird of paradise in her colorful kimono. His Oberon always walked like a cute, leering bear. Tana flew around the room gracefully, enchantingly. Impressed with his new client's appearance, Kieran asked to visit the next day to see if his lovely apprentice had mastered everything. Tana looked at him with wide-open, admiring eyes, the color of blue topazes, aquamarines and sapphires at the same time. Tana's parents are farmers, but they did not let their daughter close to the quiet farm, even though she lived in the countryside. In everyday life, except for potatoes or fried eggs, were not financially strapped. She ordered food in cafes or bought it on the way to the institute after classes. Tana was dressed with a needle, everything new, fashionable, stylish. She stood firmly on her feet. Farmers had already changed the furnishings in the rented apartment for her daughter, and every weekend they loaded a trunk full of natural products and brought them to the city. Her schooling was average. It was not the same thing to sit on the internet on social networks, to walk with friends and messengers, to communicate. She accepted Kieran's advances favorably. After a week they found themselves in the same bed, and then Tana showed him such aerobatics that he was confused. Such stunts with his wife he did not know. Tana was such a thing and obviously had a lot of experience. It was impossible to say that Kieran was not troubled by his conscience towards Oberon. He returned home late. A satisfied Rose Arnold had clearly been fed, sitting almost happily by the television, occasionally snacking on candy or tobacco smoke. Oberon herself was already asleep, having remembered to wrap up dinner for her husband so it wouldn't get cold. Kieran thought he was swearing to himself with his last words, promising himself to end it all at once. But as soon as he found himself in Tana's arms again, he forgot about everything in the world. Once, when Rose Arnold was in a particularly benign mood, he could not withstand the oppression of his radiant happiness and confessed to his mother that he was dying of love for a young girl. The woman, cynical to the core, asked him, "Is she even of legal age? Is this your new girlfriend? Make sure there's no trouble in that department. You've been asleep for a long time, haven't you?" Kieran nodded. Rose pointed a dainty finger in the direction of the bedroom. "What are you going to do with that redhead of yours?" "I'm more than satisfied with her care and attention. I'm enjoying myself. Even my injuries are hardly bothersome. You, my lovesick falcon, tell you what. You have many mutual acquaintances in our city. Even you with your mistress your wife did not tell you. I told you before my last official husband left me inherited a luxury country house. Arrange your dates only there, away from prying human eyes. Your girlfriend Tana will love it. You can be sure of it. And it's only an hour's drive from town. There's a woman looking after the house now. I'll arrange for her to stay on as au pair. And I'll keep Oberon with me for as long as possible. Do you understand me?" Rose Arnold was wildly delighted with the country estate. She was still a very young and unsophisticated woman. Such luxury only seen in the movies. The actress hid this cozy nest from strangers and her friends, many years often under the pretext of departure on tour spent on the fazenda, as she called his country mansion, time with another hardy friend. Yes, even these temporary men did not admit that this expensive real estate belongs to her. Such a tidbit could turn any seemingly in love man into a real Alfonso, hunting for the treasures of an aging beauty. Aberreen naturally had no idea of such an Alibaba cave of comfort either, nor had Kieran previously known of it. He and Tana were just out of town on that spring day when Abby had fled their home for a few breaths. Tana stretched sweetly and said to Kieran, "I have an unobvious suspicion that I'm pregnant. I've been getting nauseous in the mornings, and today I was freaked out by the smell of fried fish. Tomorrow I want to go to the drugstore to buy a test. If my hunch checks out, you're going to have a serious talk with your wife. You said you never loved her. It was just a true friendship. Well, tell that to your wife now." Hearing the suggestion that his incomparable mistress might be in an interesting position, Kieran soared to the heavens. "My baby, how happy I am. I won't wait for tomorrow. And today I will announce to my mother and Oberyn that I want to be only with you. Not a single tear will fall from the eyes of the mother of my future child. I will never make her heart race. I will never do anything to upset her." But at home, where Kieran returned from his date, elated by the news, everything went wrong at once. Rose Arnold sat among the soft cushions, her lips sour with resentment that she had been abandoned by everyone. A full vessel stood on the floor beside the carelessly abandoned bed. Mrs. Actress did not even think to try to carry it to the toilet, although during the day she quietly went to the restroom with a stick while no one sees. A wine glass stood lonely on the coffee table. Next to it was an ashtray full of cigarette butts. The woman was hungry and extremely irritated. Her first question was, is anyone in this house going to feed an old, sick, and very unhappy woman? Looking around the apartment, Kieran realized that Oberyn hadn't been home after work. There were bags of groceries standing orphaned in the hallway. When asked where she had gone, her mother replied that she never came home from work. To which Kieran argued forcefully that this was not true. Oberyn had come into the apartment, but where she had gone afterwards was the interesting part. Rose Arnold froze on the spot. She knew right away what was going on. Her sister-in-law overheard her talking to Kieran. She was so careless in some of the things she said out loud. "I didn't hear that Oberyn had run home. Well, whatever unforeseen circumstances caused her to leave again tonight to run errands. Let's wait. She'll be back soon," said Rose. Rose Arnold hoped to herself that her sister-in-law would come home soon. Where will she go without her and Kieran? That fat redhead, thought the actress, graciously allowing Kieran to make her a cup of tea, drink, and sandwiches. Then she dozed peacefully to the quiet sounds of voices on the television. She slept peacefully that night, unable to imagine that tomorrow morning her life would begin anew. Abby jumped out of the driveway so quickly that she didn't even realize at once that the weather had worsened. It was drizzling a nasty little rain, and the seemingly generous warmth of spring had suddenly disappeared. In addition, there was a penetrating wind that chilled me to the bone. The girl from the orphanage was still standing alone at the bus stop. The chances that she would get lucky again were vanishing before her eyes. "Why are you standing in the wind? You'll catch a cold and then lie in bed with a fever, won't you?" stopped the woman near the girl. "And who needs me? That with a fever, that without it," calmly answered her lilac lover. "And from this point, be more specific," grabbed her by the hand Oberyn and dragged her behind her. "Let me in. How insistent are you?" The girl fought back weakly, trying to wrestle her already numb arm from Abby. "Everyone in our orphanage is abandoned. Everyone is abandoned. Everyone's parents don't want them. Why should strangers pay attention to us?" At first, Abby stopped like a dummy. Then she realized there was no food for the two of them at Granny's house. Her old things, whatever they had, would be there. It's enough to get by for a while, but money's tight. We have to go to the supermarket again. We'll figure out who's needed and who's not needed later. In the meantime, come and visit me. Don't worry, I won't hurt you," she grumbled. "What's your name?" "Woe is me." "I am Esmeralda," said the girl. "And I am 12 years old." 12? Abby looked at her puny figure doubtfully. "I wouldn't give you more than 8. It was the sickness that wore me out," she explained easily. "That's what my mother used to say until she gave me up." A new tangle of questions began to form in Abby's mind. It was a good thing they were already approaching the store. Otherwise, she felt the strength to digest her emotions begin to run out. In the warm room, they picked up everything they could fit in the cart. Pears were already $0.05 each, and Abby kept stacking and stacking bags of fruit. Marmalade, large pineapple, oranges, grapes, bananas. Smoked sausage, some kind of uncomplicated cheese, milk, butter, sour cream flew indiscriminately next. They completed the still life in the cart: buns, pastries, fresh vegetables, pasta, and cereals. "Do you respect cheesecakes and semolina?" Oberon asked the girl with interest. "I am not capable of serious culinary feats. I'm already independent. I can cook anything: potatoes, eggs, sausages, or wieners," Esmeralda replied. But at home they sorted out their purchases, and Abby was glad in her heart that she had kept the habit of not turning off the refrigerator. It came in handy now. They needed electricity. Dinner was a quick 4-handed meal. At the table, Esme explained to Abby what her words about the orphanage had meant. "America has many sick children with rare diseases. Treatment is most often beyond the means of their parents. But many dads and moms fight their little ones to the end. Not all of them. There is a layer that over time loses patience, does not see the prospects, tired, doesn't believe it can ever end. They come in and file a parental rights waiver for people like me. I've been treated pretty well. I could live many more years on specialized medication, but my mom wouldn't even inquire about the cost. She said, 'No, Esme, I can't stand to see you suffer any longer. All these procedures, endless injections, my heart bleeds. You're so thin, so pale. I'll leave you here at the boarding school, and I'll go home to the village. The farm is unattended there. I had to give up chickens, cows, and goats. I'll show you at home. Mother bought a lot of treats that day. There were enough treats for all the wards. But she forgot to say that she had signed a waiver for me. Her daughter don't think badly of her. She's good, only weak in our therapeutic boarding school. Such cases are common. No one is surprised. Recently, Alex was abandoned. He's not used to it yet. We have a lot of lilacs around the building. The gardener's happy to see them. If we cut off the extra branches, it still has to be cut every year, and he doesn't have time to do it everywhere. So Alex, he's my friend, said Esmeralda. We've been around each other for a year now. He's got a sweet tooth. I sell lilacs at the bus stop. I climb out of the crawl space in the backyard, and then I bring him something good to keep him from crying. Did the needle in her knee or Esmeralda's words hurt Oberon? Alex, he's my friend. The class in their kindergarten class came to mind. The first flight from the garages with Kieran by the hand. She shook her head, looked at her watch. Jesus, Esme, it's 8 o'clock. There's not enough time for you at boarding school. Yeah, Alex, I've got to run already. We're right next door to you. 2 blocks away. Will you walk me out? You'll recognize our house by the bright blue fence and the sand-colored walls of the buildings outside. We have a temperature reading at 2100 hours. The babysitter won't let me go any earlier. The older boys are used to making do with their own entertainment after supper. Among the little ones, the heavier ones are more numerous. My peers are already all cured. I'm just beginning. After Seryoshka's abrupt departure, Oberon sat in a daze. How little we know about the world of those who hourly live with pain. Calmly put his hand under the drip, has long been not afraid of injections, knowing that they will bring relief. She has repeatedly seen on TV how they announce the collection of money for the treatment of another seriously ill baby. Even a couple of times she has sent money in change to the specified account. We all feel that the trouble is somewhere out there, far away, not us, she said. Tomorrow I'll have to talk to their agency about holding a charity party for these kids, something to pamper the poor in their bleak existence. And she also thought about the fact that parents who abandoned a child alone with a disease are traitors. There is no forgiveness for them. Misunderstanding. Meanwhile, Kieran puzzled over where Oberon could have gone. There was no way his wife could have found out about his affair with Taina. He had no contacts of anyone with Oberon's new job, and in his speculation he decided to call Taina. "Kodak, have you decided to let me know that you've already talked to your wife about us?" His favorite Rose asked him at once. And what was her reaction? "She's as good as gone through the ground," Kieran answered her. "Oh, and where will your redhead go?" "I'm sorry, she's not a beast at all. Who needs her?" Rose pouted her lips. "Taina, keep me posted. It's time for me to wash my hair. The girls will be in soon. A fellow student has the sniffles and we were going clubbing tonight," Kieran said. He blew his nose into his eye in the night and then pulled his jacket on. It was still raining outside, so he went looking for Oberyn. Started, of course, at Oberyn's parents' apartment. Maybe his wife had an urgent need to go there for some reason, and she was late with her business. A faint light was clearly visible behind the light curtain in the kitchen, despite this late hour. It took Kieran a couple of seconds to get to the third floor. At his call, Janie opened the door at once. "Don't bother, Kieran, you're not going in the house." "What's wrong?" "Oberyn, you're not yourself." Kieran tried to insist on his husband's rights. "Come on. I don't want to make a scene humiliating you and me to keep at least the good things that have bound us together for years. I accidentally found out about your love for another woman. Well, that happens. People drift apart in life. Let's do it in a civilized manner." Kieran, for the first time in his life, didn't know what to say to his wife, his battle buddy. "You're 100% right. You can't argue. There is no such argument. The most reasonable thing I can think of is, do you want to stay in your parents' apartment? Then let's at least pack your things so you have everything you need." Oberyn suddenly understood. The point in their relationship hadn't been set when she'd rushed out of Rose's apartment. Her husband had disowned her now, this very minute, burning bridges with his caring proposal, letting her know the Rubicon had been crossed. It was desperately painful, like when her appearance as a red-haired clown had been mocked. In fact, her appearance always made people cringe at first. But didn't Kieran know that Oberyn was not the first beauty in their town? Her grandmother used to say, "When you feel bad, Abby, think of those who are much worse off than you are right now." The woman was immediately reminded of today's encounter with the sick girl. There was so much courage and a kind of cold-blooded calmness in that child that Oberyn should have taken an example from her. She would pack up now and go to bed. Let the morning, which as rumor promises is wiser than the evening, make her look at everything with different eyes. 2 months had passed. In the intervening period, there had been global changes in the lives of Kieran and Oberyn. The former had experienced the first disappointment of his life, and one that he could not recover from. There were several reasons for his lethargic apathy and complete indifference to everything. Rose's hypothesis that she was pregnant was not confirmed, and it was good that Kieran had not learned the whole truth in that legend. In fact, Taina, who had long been intimate with the opposite sex, had been taking birth control pills, clearly following the instructions for their use. The pregnancy pranks had been designed to test her young lover for lice. Taina had come close to not expecting such a violent, enthusiastic reaction from him. And when she learned that his wife had left him, she put forward the rest of the seductive resources. Only her maneuvers were unnecessary. She enthusiastically accepted Rose's absentee invitation to pay a visit to the unhappy, ailing actress. Once in the apartment, which hadn't seen Oberyn in days and was in need of a fresh cleaning. Taina was instantly aware of the situation. It was springtime outside and the air was stale indoors. The young beauty, after listening to Rose's compliments, made a show of telling Kieran that she had toxicosis. She was still listed as a mommy-to-be at the time and went outside for a breath of clean air. Taina never returned to Rose's apartment or Kieran's life again. Oberyn had calculated ahead of time what awaited her in her future possible marriage to Kieran. She didn't even want that posh country house as a wedding present. Oberyn was sure that she could find a more interesting party for herself in this southern city. Youth and beauty would always be at a premium. Kieran had not expected such treachery from his beloved. No, he was ready to hire a nurse for his mother to take some of the household chores on himself, since Taina was soon to become a mother. But he couldn't tell her any of this. Taina had cut off contact with him once and for all. She blacklisted him wherever she could. She wouldn't open the door of her rented apartment. Stopped being friends with him on social media. The man was in shock. He'd given up everything for this love and was left with nothing. Kieran's mom couldn't keep a single caregiver around for more than 24 hours. She drove everyone crazy with her whims and kept demanding that Kieran reconcile with Taina immediately. The funny thing was that it didn't even occur to her that she was most to blame for the family's troubles. She encouraged her son's affair. She had hurt her daughter-in-law with bitter words. She never learned to appreciate human warmth and kindness. With her hair and clothes unkept, she was more and more likely to have a glass of wine. She was now a pitiful sight. Her former regal beauty was long gone. No longer an elegant lady, but a proud old woman who still fancied herself a queen, but now without her loyal subjects and admirers. Kieran had the good sense not to bother Oberyn with vain requests to return. He wondered how his ex-wife managed to keep her mother's apartment in perfect order. Oberyn studied and worked. She'd gotten her diploma with honors. In her agency, she was known as an indispensable employee. Lately, she'd been seen several times in the company of Matthew, the electrician. Their friendship began unexpectedly with an unfortunate accident during a children's party. It was the hottest time of the year. Summer had just passed its second half. The thermometer was already afraid of heights, approaching the mark of plus 40 degrees Celsius. Split systems tiredly drove cool air in the hall for festive celebrations. On that July day, as the biggest joke, the clients had booked a themed party for their daughter based on Andersen's fairy tale, The Snow Queen. The highlight of the party was to be the outlandish ice cream cake still waiting in the freezer. After playing around pretending to be a cotton candy snowdrift, the evening's host, Oberyn, realized that something had gone wrong. The heel of her sandals had gotten stuck in an unknown gap in the wooden floor. For the third time, the children walked in a joyful round dance around Gerda and Kai, who had found each other. Next came the transition to the feasting room, where drinks and desserts awaited. Matthew, who had been watching the dress rehearsal before, assessed the situation in a flash. The ex-military man, who had excellent physical fitness, a real giant with hard, as if carved out of stone features, picked up Oberyn in his arms, deftly pulled her feet out of her sandals, and as if nothing had happened, brought and sat her at the table with the children to the applause of the audience. "Matthew, help me out," she smiled warmly at him. I was at a loss. I didn't know what to do. "It's a pleasure to carry such a wonderful woman in your arms." The usually unkind electrician mumbled, shook her hand in embarrassment, and then disappeared out the door. Oberyn would not be rusty. She's not a nun, after all. The next day, the whole staff was already enjoying buns baked according to grandmother's old recipe, and the redhead whispered in the electrician's ear, "I baked them for you, Matthew. But there were so many of them, I thought I'd treat everyone." Matthew and Oberyn often walked home together from work. One day, out of the blue, the woman shared her idea with him. "I'm friends with a girl from a children's treatment center. Oberyn is friends with an orphan girl whose mother gave up her parental rights. Oberon finds out what documents she needs to gather to formalize the girl's guardianship. However, she was persistently advised that the girl would be better off with a full family, since Oberyn had just divorced her husband. Already divorced, Oberyn explained. "Did I hear you were married?" Matthew wondered. "I'm not one to court a lady with a wedding ring. Would you take me on as daddy to your little friend?" "I'll think about it," Oberyn smiled slyly at him, looking a little like an oddly ginger-colored bear. "But I promise I won't be thinking for long." And she laughed out loud. At home that summer evening, Oberyn pulled a round box out of an old dresser. There was no exotic lady's charm hidden inside. Here lay a red-haired clown costume. Tomorrow, Oberyn was going to announce to the girl that she would soon have a new home with a foster mom and dad. Such news was a celebration for both of them. So it was decided to announce it to the girl not as Oberyn, but as Amelia the Red Clown. Let tomorrow in the children's ward of the orphanage will be a little brighter for everyone. Red-haired and desperate clowns, they are a bit of a magician. Just don't tell anyone about it, or people will torture them with requests for happiness. Happiness has to be earned, otherwise it's not real. Vivian decided to surprise her foreign fiancé and learned Italian, but accidentally overhearing his conversation. Before leaving the office, Vivian habitually looked at herself from head to toe in the large mirror by the door. Her blonde hair fell in waves over her exposed shoulders. The light dress beautifully outlined her slender figure. The length of her legs was emphasized by sandals on a low heel. The girl smiled at her reflection. Yes, she was completely satisfied with what she saw. She especially liked her own eyes, lately huge blue lakes, which now had a special light in them. They sparkled with joy, glowing with anticipation of happy changes. And love, of course. Yes, Vivian was in love for the first time in her 23 years. So much so that her heart jumped out of her chest at the mere thought of the person she loved. It turned out that all the romantic experiences that visited the girl before meeting him were not serious, even her feelings for Ben. "Yes, beautiful, beautiful. Do not doubt it," smiled Vivian Amelie, a colleague about 15 years older than the girl. From the very beginning, she had taken care of the new young employee who had just graduated from university, taking her under her wing. Vivian was grateful to Amelie for that. "Thank you," she smiled radiantly at her colleague. "Where are you going after work?" "On a date with your Italian." No, Vivian shook her head. "You know, I decided to surprise him to learn Italian. It's the 10th lesson today, and I have to hurry. I decided not to tell him until later. He will be happy and surprised, of course." "That's right," said Amelie. "It is necessary to know the language. You never know." Vivian nodded, said goodbye to her colleague, and slipped out the door. A cab was waiting for her at the gate of the building. On the way to the language learning center, Vivian looked at the pictures on her phone. It was a long drive. The course was on the other side of the city. There was no place closer. English was taught in many places, but Italian only in this center. Apparently the language was not so popular, but it was easy enough to learn. Or maybe Vivian was so eager to speak the language of her beloved that she made rapid progress? Her teacher was very complimentary. Looking at the photos from last year's vacation in Rome, Vivian relived the pleasant moments over and over again. Here, against the background of St. Peter's Cathedral, she had no idea that a fateful meeting would soon await her. And here, not far from the Colosseum, Vivian had already fallen head over heels in love with the handsome Grace. He suddenly appeared in her life and immediately changed it, coloring it in 1,000 different colors, turning it into a kind of endless holiday. Energetic, lively, cheerful guy always infected Vivian with his positivity and good mood. And what compliments the temperamental Italian showered on the girl. They communicated in English. Vivian knew the language well, as she studied at a language school. Grace also knew it well, because she traveled a lot around the world and communicated with different people. The girl in general was incredibly open and sincere. She could find a common language with anyone. That trip to Italy was a gift from her parents. The girl graduated from the University of Economics with honors. Actually, economics never particularly attracted her. Vivian liked to take pictures. She got great pictures. She preferred portraits. Many noted that the girl managed to emphasize the inner beauty and uniqueness of people. "Yes, you are a real talent," more than once exclaimed Ben. The same Ben with whom Vivian was in love all her school years. But he only saw her as a friend. Between young people since childhood were warm, close relations, however, purely amicable. Girlfriends also praised Vivian in the photo and often asked to shoot them for social networks. "Nobody takes pictures of me as beautifully as you do, Trixie," a neighbor and part-time best friend declared. "There's no Photoshop required on these photos of you, because you're very beautiful yourself," Vivian smiled at her friend. "No," Trixie sighed. "I'm fat and I have a potato nose and small eyes. But in your pictures, yes, I'm beautiful. Too bad they're the only pictures. But you're really beautiful from every angle and in every light." Vivian knew it was true. Ever since she was a child, Vivian had heard people complimenting her on her looks. She was blonde with correct facial features and huge blue eyes, graceful, fragile, with translucent skin. Vivian herself would like her skin to be darker. But she did not even tan, no matter how much she used special creams. Friends and relatives chorused about the beauty and delicate appearance of her porcelain skin. So in the end, Vivian accepted her aristocratic pallor. Still, she had always liked swarthy people. They seemed bright, strong, incredibly attractive and beautiful. So after graduating from university, Vivian first went on a trip abroad without her parents. She was accompanied by the same faithful Trixie. She had long since earned money on her own after graduating from college and could afford to pay for the trip. It was an unforgettable vacation. The friends spent the first half of the day walking around the historical sites of Rome with a tour group, as part of which they came to Italy. And then they had their own time to get acquainted with the city. The girls visited everywhere they saw, all the sights, walked along the labyrinths of narrow, confusing streets, sat in restaurants and inspected showrooms. But the greatest pleasure for the friends was to spend time on the beach. The girls quickly realized how to get there. You take a train at the local station. Half an hour and you are already in a paradise place with white sandy beaches, where turquoise waves roll up on the shore. My friends usually settled down under a free umbrella, of which there were always plenty. They took turns going to the sea, one to look after things, the other to splash in the warm waves. At one of these moments, when Vivian was left guarding the beach bags, he approached her. Vivian had long ago realized that her appearance, blonde hair, pale skin, is attractive to Italians. They are swarthy, with black hair, dark eyes. Blonde, for them, a miracle of wonders. The girl constantly received compliments on her appearance, and not only from men. Vivian, in turn, was charmed by Italians so friendly, smiling, and very, very beautiful. Vivian already had a lot of pictures of smiling, swarthy faces in her phone. You could make an exhibition. They were all so interesting, sincere, and lively. But Grace was special, the most special. Almond-shaped black eyes, a beautiful tan body, a cap of curly hair the color of a crow's wing. Bright orange bathing shorts emphasized the darker shade of his skin. His arms and chest were literally burning with muscle. The guy had clearly spent quite a bit of time at the gym, but he didn't look skewed, just athletic. He then crouched down in front of Vivian, who was taking a salty bath, and smiled broadly at her. His cheeks formed charming dimples, which finally conquered the girl. "Hello," he said in not-so-perfect English. "My name is Grace. And you? How do you like the beach?" "I'm Vivian." From excitement, the girl could hardly form a phrase in English, although she knew it well since childhood. "What English?" Even in Russian, Vivian would not immediately find an answer. Such a handsome man. And not just handsome, but Grace had a special energy about him. He seemed to mesmerize Vivian with his black eyes and his open smile. Beautiful, the young man grinned. If you think this beach is beautiful, you haven't seen real beauty. Vivian could argue that she could see the real beauty right in front of her. I wish I could take a picture of this handsome guy. But it's kind of embarrassing to ask. Usually the girl didn't hesitate to ask such a question to people. Only now it was different. Her heart was pounding in her chest like frantic palms in the gym. At the same time, Vivian desperately hoped that her interlocutor did not notice her excitement. There's a deserted beach nearby, just next door, and only the locals know about it. There are no tourists there. And there, it's much better and more interesting, the guy told her, keeping his eyes on Vivian. In his gaze, the girl saw interest and admiration. Vivian knew, of course, that she had an attractive appearance. Others often looked at her that way. However, their gazes did not have such a hypnotic effect on the girl. It had never happened to her before. Vivian sat down on the towel. The boy, after asking permission, settled down next to her. From the realization that he cared for her, Vivian literally blossomed before her eyes. "This is so great. It's incredible," she exclaimed. "Why don't we go to that deserted and beautiful beach and go for a swim? You, me, and my friend. I've been watching you guys for a long time. I've noticed that you're not alone." Vivian tensed. The idea seemed both tempting and dangerous. After all, she didn't know this man at all. Although on an intuitive level, the girl already trusted her new acquaintance completely. Still, Vivian had always been distinguished by rationality. And she couldn't just go out with Grace like that. He noticed it and slapped his forehead with the palm of his hand. "I'm a fool. I didn't even think about what it looked like from the outside." "A stranger lures two girls into a deserted place," he said. "I'm sorry, I just lost my head at your beauty. Immediately I wanted to show you my favorite place, to share my impressions. My mom always says I talk first and think later. That's my trouble." Grace's remorse looked so comical that Vivian relaxed and smiled again. She wouldn't risk leaving the beach with a guy she didn't know, even if he was so handsome. But she didn't want to break up with him now either. If Grace left, they'd probably never see each other again. Rome is a big city. "Why? What if I invited you and your friend somewhere a little more crowded?" As if he'd read her mind, Grace suggested it. "For example, there's a disco in town tonight at my favorite bar. It'll be fun. Will you come?" Vivian immediately said yes. She'd definitely get Trixie to go to the event. She wouldn't even have to persuade her friends. She would be happy to spend the evening in a fun and interesting way. And then Trixie came to replace Vivian at her post. Seeing Grace, Vivian was a little embarrassed. Of course she was. Anyone would be confused by those beautiful black eyes. Trixie, always a little embarrassed by her fullness, stood half-turned toward Grace. She thought she looked slimmer that way. Vivian immediately realized that her friend was instinctively trying to present herself in the most favorable light. But after a couple minutes, Trixie's embarrassment was gone. Just like Vivian, she was mesmerized by the young man's every word and laughed at his witty jokes. The time flew by. The young people talked, becoming closer and clearer to each other. That day they laughed a lot, played beach volleyball, had fun on the beach. It was wonderful. Grace was polite, alert, and with Trixie. But both girls realized who was the real reason for his presence in this small company. Vivian melted with happiness as she caught Grace's admiring gaze. The sun was already sinking when they left for the hotel. "We must go," Vivian said regretfully. "I don't want to leave, but we have to get ready for tonight." "I'll be waiting for you," Grace smiled at them. "We won't be going away for long." "I don't know how to suggest it without scaring you. Why don't I give you a ride to the hotel? I have a car right here in the parking lot. The friends looked at each other. They both had the same thoughts in their heads. On the one hand, they didn't want to take the train and then spend half an hour in it. The girls were a little tired from the water and the sun, the abundance of impressions. And there was a party waiting for them, for which they had to prepare thoroughly. It was much better to spend some more time with the talkative, cheerful Grace. And I wanted to see his car. Grace seemed like a man you could trust. Except that if all intruders were like intruders, there would be no crime. The girlfriends had their doubts. Grace looked calmly at the girls, waiting for an answer. Vivian suddenly, without expecting it, blurted out, "Yes, give us a ride, please." "Thank you very much." It seemed to Vivian that if they refused now, Grace would be offended, and she didn't want to offend him at all. Trixie nodded with a smile, confirming her friend's words. Grace brightened. The parking lot was spacious yet packed. No wonder the weather was hot, and many people had flocked to the beach to enjoy the warm, gentle waves. Grace led the girls over to a beautiful sports car. Vivian and Trixie looked at it. They didn't know much about makes, but it was clearly not a cheap car. The sleek, dark green, streamlined, a little predatory and incredibly beautiful iron horse suited its owner very well. "Did you like my friend?" Grace smiled contentedly. "I've recently added to my collection. I love cars like this." Collection. Vivian suddenly looked at Grace with different eyes. There on the beach, he had seemed simple, natural, very close. But Grace must be very rich. He had a collection of automobiles. Vivian felt embarrassed again in his presence. Wealthy people are like representatives of another world. How to communicate with them, how to fit in. "Come on," Grace suddenly put his arm around Vivian in a reassuring way. His warmth and sincerity removed the awkwardness of the moment. The girls looked at each other and slipped into the cool cabin. The way he looked at you, Trixie shared her impressions in the room. She had already showered and was working on her hair, twisting it into tight curls. If someone looked at me like that, how happy I'd be. Am I exaggerating? Vivian argued. Now that Grace wasn't around, it seemed to her that she had made up his looks of admiration for herself, just because she wanted to. She'd gotten it into her head that this handsome man, who also happened to be rich, was looking at her in a special way. But in fact, Grace is just having fun, meeting cute tourists, having fun with them, just because he's sociable. And the blonde Vivian with her white skin and blue eyes is exotic for him. An interesting novelty, nothing more. "No way," Trixie exclaimed. "He's really fascinated by you." You could see it from the outside. Trixie's friend dispelled Vivian's doubts. "I'm even a little jealous." "Don't worry," Vivian said brightly. She was very encouraged by Trixie's words. "We're looking for a handsome man for you tonight." Grace picked the girls up exactly at the appointed time. The friends got into his car without any fear. This time the guy was on another iron horse, a black Mercedes. "I think this car is more suitable for the evening," he smiled, seeing the perplexity in the eyes of the girls. "Mercedes is elegant and beautiful, just like you." Vivian's attention was not lost on Grace, who looked at her with admiring eyes. It was no wonder the girl had done her best. She was wearing her favorite tight little black dress, emphasizing the graceful lines of her figure. It suited the girl, and she knew it very well. Diplomatic Grace showered compliments on both friends, but Vivian felt that his heart belonged to her. The guy didn't hide it. It was a marvelous evening, delicious wine, fiery dancing, fun until morning. Grace introduced the girls to his friends. There wasn't much socializing going on. First, the music was so loud that it was impossible to hear the interlocutor. Secondly, the language barrier. Not all of Grace's friends knew English. Nevertheless, the friends had a lot of fun. At the end of the evening, Grace even dared to kiss Vivian. They were dancing, pressed against each other, among a crowd of similarly heated young people. And then that kiss. Vivian was dizzy with surprise and emotion. "I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself," he smiled, looking his companion in the eyes. "You are so beautiful. You have no idea how beautiful you are." After these words, Vivian kissed Grace. He embraced her. It seemed to both of them that they were alone on the dance floor, but in fact they were surrounded by hundreds of people. Grace and Vivian met every day since then. At first, Trixie accompanied the couple everywhere, but soon she refused to be the third extra. "I feel like I'm just in the way, like the fifth wheel on a cart," she admitted. "No, you can have your romantic rendezvous without me," Trixie admitted. Vivian didn't mind. Indeed, she felt freer and happier alone with Grace. They took many walks. Grace showed the girl the sights that are usually inaccessible to the eyes of a tourist. The real old Rome, ancient and striking. And they also visited the beach, to which Grace had called her friends at the beginning of their acquaintance. It turned out to be a really beautiful place, hidden from prying eyes by low rocks. A kind of paradise cove. Soft sand heated by the sun, huge boulders, gentle waves, and nobody, absolutely nobody around. This piece of land was a whole world that belonged only to Grace and Vivian. "I want to live here with you forever, and never go anywhere," Grace confessed more than once, hugging Vivian, and she felt the same way. The young people got to know each other better and better. Grace told about himself. It turned out that he was the son of rich parents. His family owned several wineries. "We have a lot of vineyards in the province," Grace shared details of his life. "I have been accustomed to labor since childhood. I know everything about wine production from the very basics. My father says that the man who will get our empire must be able not only to give orders." Grace had an apartment in Rome, and he'd come here for a vacation once in a while, like now. But the guy lived with his parents in the province, near the largest of the family factories and a huge vineyard in the family estate. Apparently, it was a huge house with a beautiful, spacious garden and even a stable on the territory. Grace loved horseback riding. Recently, the guy, like Vivian, graduated from university. Only the girl studied economics and the young man studied management. Grace loved to travel. He told Vivian a lot about his trips, where the guy has not only visited Europe, Asia, Africa. Grace saw Stalinist monasteries and ruins of Mayan temples, admired the Grand Canyon, and photographed against the backdrop of Niagara Falls. Vivian listened to him with her mouth open in amazement. Wow! They were almost the same age. Grace had indeed traveled extensively and had a wealth of life experience, having worked in the family business since his youth. His generosity and attention to Vivian pays off. He gives her expensive gifts, pays all the expenses during their dates. His gallantry and aristocratic manners impressed the girl. At the same time, the upcoming parting is very hard for both of them. Vivian is very attached to Grace. He has become for her a literally vital person just for this short time. Grace also clearly does not want to part with his favorite girl. However, he tries to reassure her, saying that this is not the end, but only the beginning of their relationship. Their fates are already intertwined, and they will not lose each other despite the physical separation. Gracie is soon to leave Rome as well. It is obvious that very deep feelings have developed between them in this short time. A difficult period of separation awaits them, but they hope to continue their relationship despite the distance and obstacles. The final scene at the night fountain is very touching and romantic. Work, business. I only stayed in LA for you. It was my happiest 3 weeks. They were my happiest, too, Vivian said, holding back tears. I don't want to break up with you. We'll keep in touch. Social networks, messengers. I'll write to you every day, even every hour. If you don't mind, of course. Of course, I'm all for it, exclaimed the girl. But such communication, it's still not the same. I understand. I'll miss you too. I've never felt like this before. And as soon as business permits, I'll come and see you right away. I'll do that. I'm looking forward to it. Vivian left in tears. Grace drove her friends to the bus station, where a tourist bus was waiting for them. For a while, the guy accompanied them on his sports car, and then he left. All the way, Vivian looked at the photo of her lover. She took it on the eve of departure at the same fountain, where she couldn't stand it and cried in the arms of a young man. Grace smiled from the screen of the smartphone, but in his eyes read the sadness of the upcoming long parting. It was the photo that caught Vivian's eye now when she was browsing through the gallery section on her way to the language course. The girl smiled, remembering the touching moment. It seemed then that the separation would be eternal. Vivian had been afraid. Very afraid that Grace would quickly forget her. As they say, out of sight, out of mind. Vivian even shared her fears with the young man that last night and introduced him to a popular Russian, saying, "Well, I know another suitable phrase," said the boy, looking earnestly into Vivian's eyes. "Separation is like the wind, small passions are extinguished, but the big ones are only blown away. My feelings for you are so great that separation will only make them stronger and stronger. I miss you already." Grace kept his promise. He did write to Vivian often, sending cheerful messages, asking questions about her life, telling her about himself. Sometimes he sent her pictures of vineyards, sea, rocks. The lovers were constantly in touch. Surprisingly, Grace was right. Separation really strengthened their relationship. Young people recognized each other closer and closer. They became relatives, learned to feel each other at a distance. Grace periodically made surprises to his beloved. Hundreds of kilometers were not a hindrance for him. The guy often ordered the delivery of flowers and sweets. It was always unexpected and caused a smile and surprise to Vivian. She was pleased that Grace cared about her, trying to please her, even being so far away. On New Year's Eve, Grace gave her beloved a present. A courier delivered to her home an evening dress from a famous couturier. In it, Vivian went to the first corporate party in her life. There she made a real sensation. Men were lining up to dance with her. The lady did not refuse the cavaliers, but all attempts to continue the relationship stopped at the root. Her heart was no longer free. Vivian waited for Grace. He promised he'd come, so he would. The boy loves her so much. And Vivian was crazy about him. They're going to be together. Her parents knew about her daughter's relationship with a foreigner, but they didn't pay much attention to it. A holiday romance, Mom smiled. "I know how dizzying they can be. I know it from hearsay, by the way. Just don't count on anything. Relationships like that are quick to start, but just as quick to forget." Trixie, too, thought there'd be no sequel to the torrid affair. Californians are just temperamental, unlike our guys. They know how to woo. Grace is cool, but I don't think he's really coming. If he did, he would have been here a long time ago. I mean, it's been almost a year. But Vivian didn't believe what her family said. She knew that Grace was just busy. He was helping his father run his business. And that's not easy. Grace would come to see Vivian if he promised. There was a lot going on in the girl's life at the time. After returning from a memorable trip, Vivian got her first job in her life. Thanks to her father's connections, she was hired by a local oil company as an economist. The salary turned out to be such that the girl aghast when she saw the size of the transfer for the first time. Wow. So now I'll be able to provide for myself. And with a lot of dignity, Vivian exclaimed. "Well, we have a very grown-up girl," said on the day of the first paycheck at the family dinner Mom. "Maybe it's time for you to move out and start living on your own." "I think so, too," smiled the father, who looked proudly at his grown-up daughter, so beautiful, intelligent, and successful. A successful outcome of parental care and investment. Vivian clapped her hands with joy, just like a little girl. She had had her own apartment for a long time. Her father had bought it for her when she turned 18. "It's your future," he said then. The apartment was wonderful, spacious, bright, located in the center of the city. Vivian was afraid to imagine how much it cost. But then, as a student, she could not move into a new home. "You're not ready to live on your own yet," her mother said. "Let it stand for now. The apartment is not going anywhere. We'll renovate it slowly. And you study, you'll grow up. Then you will move in," nodded my father. And now, in the opinion of her parents, the daughter, who began to earn money herself, was quite ready to live separately. A new job, a new apartment, a new relationship, albeit at a distance. So many impressions, so many emotions. Life was booming, playing with bright colors. Vivian sometimes envied herself. All she needed to be happy was Grace by her side. Communication via video link was one thing, but the feeling of his warm hands on her shoulders was quite another. And recently he showed up at the doorstep of her new apartment. Grace had called the day before, unexpectedly, and warned him that he would send a courier in the morning with flowers and a small gift. When the bell rang, Vivian assumed it was a messenger. She opened the door and was stunned, unable to believe her eyes. On the threshold stood Grace. He was holding a bouquet of roses. The guy was smiling broadly. Vivian's legs even gave out. She gasped. Grace deftly took Vivian by the waist. They walked into the apartment arm in arm. She didn't go to work that day. She called her boss and took the day off. She couldn't leave Grace when he was finally around. That same morning, Grace proposed to Vivian. He didn't wait. "I want you to be my wife," he said, squeezing Vivian's wrist firmly but gently. "I realize that I cannot without you. This separation has not been easy for me. I thought of you every minute. I wanted to be near you all the time. I can't go on like this. Marry me. We'll go and live in my apartment in Rome, just you and me. Do you agree?" Vivian wrapped her arms around Grace's neck and kissed him instead of answering. Of course she agreed. Moreover, to hear such words from the lips of her beloved was her cherished dream, which was coming true right now. Her parents, having learned about their daughter's decision, of course, panicked at first. "How is it so? You will live in a foreign country, away from us. You never know. And what if they hurt you there?" Mom lamented. But after getting acquainted with Grace, my parents changed their opinion. The young man charmed them. They accepted the fact that the daughter will live in Italy with her beloved husband, and even rejoiced for her. And Grace generally liked everyone with whom Vivian introduced him. But you bet people are always attracted by sincerity, friendliness, sense of humor, energy. Grace had plenty of those. The only person who was not properly impressed by the handsome, wealthy Italian was Ben. Vivian frowned, remembering her childhood friend. He usually supported her in everything. How many times he had helped her out, protected her, comforted her. But this one was acting strangely. Trixie says it's jealousy. She says Ben's been in love with Vivian since he was a kid. That's why he won't accept Grace. But her friend is clearly mistaken. Vivian's been in love with Ben for a long time. What about him? He's only seen her as a friend from the beginning. When she was a teenager, she used to cry into her pillow at night because of it. What else could it be? She tried so hard to please her classmates, she chose outfits, did her makeup, tried to do her hair. And then she'd see him on the gymnasium in the arms of another girl. Was Ben the only one who found something in these girls? Vivian looked out the window of the cab as it passed the movie theater. How many times had she and Ben run here for horror movie screenings? Both loved such thrilling plots with unexpected turns of events. Vivian, of course, cowardly squeezed her eyes shut at the scary moments. Ben held her hand tightly, keeping his gaze on the screen. The girl hoped that someday in the darkness of the movie hall, her classmate would hug her. Maybe even kiss her, like his many girlfriends. But it never happened. "You're such a great friend," Ben said when Vivian let him copy his homework or help him with algebra. "You're so easy for me to talk to. Always accepting, always supportive. You're even better than the guys." Those were very dubious compliments for Vivian. She wanted Ben to see her not as a friend, but as her favorite girl. But it didn't work out. The childhood crush had faded. How many times can you knock on a closed door? But what remained were strong friendships. And Trixie? She doesn't get it. She got some other jealousy thing going on. Yeah, Ben's just teasing her, that's all. It's his usual way of talking to her. He called his friend's fiancée nothing but Angelica. Another convention. Too bad we don't know each other. I'd be texting her too, he said wryly. His name is Grace. What kind of name is that? I think it's feminine, masculine. It's actually Italian. Maybe your name sounds feminine to him too. It sounds like Andrea. Is that his cousin's sister's name? I don't care what he thinks it sounds like. He's Grace. That's all. Grace means angel, and Angel Ben is the one with the wings and the halo over his head. Thinking back on those joking exchanges, Vivian was smiling now. He's funny after all. Ben's sarcasm sometimes confused her, but Vivian was sure that if anything happened, he would come to her rescue. It would be a pity to part with him, friends and parents. But most importantly, Grace would be there for her, the man who made her heart beat so fast that it seemed to be about to jump out of her chest. Grace had been living with Vivian for almost 3 weeks now. Now he had the opportunity to leave the business for a while, but he had to return soon, and he intended to come home with his wife. The wedding was scheduled for the end of next month. It couldn't be sooner. All the nearest dates were taken. There were only a few weeks left. Preparations were in full swing at the mutual desire of the bride and groom. The wedding was to be a modest celebration in the circle of the closest people. True, the parents were a little disappointed. It turns out that they literally, from the birth of their little girl, dreamed of seeing their daughter in a bride's outfit and dance at her wedding to cheerful compositions. And here it is. And Grace's relatives aren't going to be there. As if the father cannot leave the business, and the mother, respectively, does not want to fly without her husband. Oh, that's okay. Then you'll get to know each other when you come to visit us, the daughter reassured her parents. We will show you Italy. Wonderful country. It's still strange somehow, not human, shook her head Mom. Even with the groom's relatives have not met once. But in the end, the parents accepted the decision of the newlyweds. The main thing that the daughter was happy. They saw the joy in Vivian's eyes when she was with Grace. Then so be it. The cab stopped at the porch of the Language Learning Center. Vivian paid the driver and went to class. Today was an interesting subject. Vivian was beginning to understand Italian speech, but only when people spoke slowly and clearly. And Grace, when communicating in his native language, spoke very fast. Basically, a lot of Italians talk like that. When the guy talked to his relatives or friends via video link, they answered him at the same pace, quickly and emotionally. Vivian could only make out individual words, and the meaning of the phrases eluded her. That was all right. Rome wasn't built at once either. She would learn. True, Vivian did not tell her fiancé about her lessons. She was preparing a surprise for the young man. He would be surprised when Vivian once addressed him in the purest Italian. The girl was fluent in English and French. Probably because of this, learning Italian was so fast. Vivian was far ahead of her classmates, so she was transferred to the next level ahead of schedule. And now she had almost mastered the next stage. Vivian wandered leisurely through the park in her own thoughts. The wedding date was approaching. Grace was still staying with her. It was wonderful. While Vivian worked, he cleaned the rooms, cooked delicious Italian meals. Often he would greet his fiancée with a perfectly set table plates with the next culinary masterpiece, a bottle of luxury wine, even candles. Life with him resembled a magical, romantic, beautiful fairy tale. What would happen when they moved to Italy? Lately, however, Vivian, who was making progress in Italian, began to notice something strange. Grace was often talking to someone, with a man's voice coming out of the receiver. It sounded like the person he was talking to was unhappy about something. Vivian could make out individual words, as it was hard to hear. Debt's police crook Grace kept reassuring the man, assuring him that everything would be resolved soon. He did it in an exaggeratedly calm tone, probably so that Vivian would not guess the trouble. Most likely her lover did not want to upset her. The guy didn't even suspect that his fiancée now understood Italian, so he thought that the girl did not know about anything. And Vivian? She still shared her concerns with Trixie. Vivian shrugged her shoulders. Who else to share it with? Her parents had only recently gotten used to the idea of their daughter marrying a foreigner and moving to another country for permanent residence. No, they cannot be worried unnecessarily. There remains a faithful friend. She always listens and supports. What's so strange? Trixie dismissed it. He's a businessman. A business is always some kind of problem that has to be dealt with as it comes. It's just business as usual for him. That's why he seems calm. I think this man is threatening him, calling him a crook and threatening the police. I wouldn't worry if I were you. Your Grace will handle it. He's an experienced businessman. You're working yourself up, and he's not even paying much attention to the person he's talking to. But if you're so worried about it, just talk to Grace, and it'll all work out, Trixie suggested. No, Vivian smiled. I don't want him to know I'm learning Italian yet. Let it be a surprise. Your picture, Trixie grinned. How do you want it? Vivian wandered through the park where she loved to play with her friends as a child. Just next to the road you cross it and the native yard, her parents' house. Today after work, Vivian decided to stop by her parents' house to pick up some documents. The upcoming meeting was a joy. The girl was quickly beginning to miss both her mom and dad. It was still unclear to her how she would be able to be without them for so long. You can't go to another country very often. Everything. So she would have to communicate through the laptop screen. By the way, Grace is as reverent as his fiancée is about her mother. He often calls her and talks to her via video link. Future mother-in-law Vivian is still a very young and spectacular woman. She has the same as her son's expressive eyes, black eyebrows, well-defined lips, and swarthy skin. And this woman's hair always looks like she just came out of a beauty parlor, dark, shiny, slightly curly. Yes, this lady is gorgeous. No wonder the wife of a successful businessman, owner of several wineries and hundreds of hectares of vineyards, must live up to her status. Vivian, too, would eventually become an elegant woman like her mother-in-law. Grace's mother smiled at Vivian from her laptop screen, spoke to her in Italian, and generally seemed friendly. Grace had said more than once that his mother was pleased with her son's choice. You are a wonderful girl, very beautiful, sweet, well-mannered, he passed on the words of his mother. And my mother also thinks that we will make wonderful children, her grandchildren, because we are very different in appearance. And such a mix of genes is always interesting. Vivian smiled then. At that time she was not as fluent in Italian as she is now. That's why she couldn't communicate with her future relative who didn't know English, but she was very anxious to do so. Grace's mother seemed to be a very pleasant and interesting conversationalist. They will surely find a common language. It was true that more often mother and son talked on the phone. Vivian heard sometimes fragments of their conversations, only Grace's lines because his mother spoke quietly. They seemed to be discussing plans for the future. At least Grace kept promising her that everything would be fixed very soon and he would fix everything as soon as he got there. Apparently the woman just missed her son very much. Vivian. Hello, a very familiar male voice sounded behind her. The girl turned around and couldn't hold back a smile. Ben was rushing towards her, spreading his arms for a friendly hug. How long it's been since we've seen each other. We used to spend so much time together. You look great." Ben praised Vivian with an attentive look. Despite the fact that she would soon be Grace's wife, Vivian felt butterflies in her stomach at the compliment. Her body must have reacted in the usual way. Vivian had been secretly in love with Ben for so long, and he had only seen her as a friend. Yeah, Ben was a great friend. And from the bullies Vivian protected, and with the boys teased her in a manly talk, and in the evenings met a neighbor at the bus stop when her father could not. Vivian was choreographing at the time. Rehearsals ended late, and the road from the bus stop to home in the dark seemed dangerous to the girl. But next to Ben, smiling, cheerful, reliable, she always felt like behind a stone wall. They were classmates from the 1st to the 11th grade, sometimes even sitting at the same desk, but they were usually quickly seated. Ben shamelessly cheated from the excellent Vivian, and she only encouraged it. Of course, such a thing could not pass the attention of teachers, so they covered it up. But Vivian managed to pass the cheat sheets to Ben, even when they were sitting at different ends of the class. Ben was very good-looking, tall, athletic, cheerful, with green eyes framed by thick lashes and hair the color of ripe wheat. He had the right facial features. Since he was a little boy, he had been a joker and the soul of the company. He played sports and guitar. He also read a lot, though more fiction and adventure novels. If he swallowed textbooks with the same zeal, he would be an excellent student. But the guy was attracted to other things: socializing, parties, hiking. Around him always hovered people's secret and frank admirers, buddies, friends. He was like a magnet for adventure and often became the hero of interesting stories. His life was like a soap opera. Vivian used to be desperately jealous when she saw Ben strolling along with his girlfriend. But he never noticed. He told her about his girlfriends. At first, he admiringly described the girl's virtues, and after a while he shared his disappointment and sadness. Vivian always listened to his friend and, if necessary, supported him with a word or gave valuable advice. "You understand me like no one else," Ben confessed more than once. "It's even strange, as if you could read my mind." "It's because we grew up together," she smiled back. "I guess that's why it's so easy with you. It feels so good." Vivian nodded in response. She felt exactly the same way, only she also wanted Ben to hug her, to kiss her, to hold her close. Only Vivian had never once even hinted to the guy about her feelings. Why not? Because she was afraid, I guess. Because what if confessing would push Ben away from her? And even if it didn't, it would make things awkward between them. It's not going to be as easy and pleasant as it was before. No, let it go on as it was. However, once Vivian was still close to opening up to a childhood friend. Then 18-year-old Ben, a second-year student at a local engineering school, suddenly decided to get married. The news came as a thunderbolt to Vivian. She still hoped that one day the guy would pay attention to her, not only as a friend. It happens. But if Ben gets married, Vivian's dream will not come true. The guy's girlfriend was a classmate. Vivian often saw them together. She was a spectacular person, with a lush shape and bright red hair. Not like Vivian herself, thin, almost transparent, and pale as a moth. At that moment, the girl saw herself as unassuming and unattractive. At least Ben's future wife certainly outshone her with her brightness and temperament. Before the wedding, Ben walked around a little anxious. He tried to behave as before, joking, having fun, making jokes. But Vivian could see that her childhood friend had something wrong with him. "Why did you decide to get married so early?" One day she dared to ask a direct question. "I still have to study and study. I'll have to work here. What about university?" Vivian knew that Ben had dreamed of becoming a ship mechanic since childhood. That's why he went to engineering school. It took a lot of hard work, but he did it. And he was very proud of it. You see, then looked seriously at Vivian. Ben, she's expecting a baby, so there's not much of a way out. "Do you love her?" Vivian blurted out before she could think about what she was saying. "Yes, I do. Of course I love her," Ben said, a little uncertainly. How many tears Vivian had shed afterward, face buried in her pillow. Now she felt sorry not only for herself, who had lost her last hope of happiness with the man she loved. She felt sorry for Ben, too. She'd realized during that brief conversation that her friend was clearly unhappy, not by accident, because of circumstances. It had happened that way. Of course, Ben would marry the girl. He's always been honest and responsible, and then he'll spend the rest of his life suffering with a wife he doesn't love. Vivian sobbed over this life tragedy that could never be undone. But the wedding never took place. One day, Ben overheard the bride talking to another guy. In this dialogue, she admitted to that young man that the child is definitely his, swore, cited evidence, the timing of their dates. Her interlocutor clearly did not want to get married, so the lady had no other choice but to set up a date with Ben. You see, Ben shared the details of the story with Vivian. She told me over the phone that when she found out she was pregnant and I didn't want to get married, she decided to dump the baby on me. I didn't realize why she was so clingy to me at parties, even though she'd never noticed before. I was naive. After that night, she told me she was expecting a baby with me, and we need to formalize our relationship sooner rather than later. Of course, when Ben heard this dialogue, he demanded an explanation. His fiancée tried to make up something, somehow to get out of the situation. But Ben had already heard everything with his own ears. He then met with the child's real father to make sure, and he confirmed it. He also cursed Ben with a swear word and a naive young man. In the end, the man married his desperate girlfriend and recognized the baby, and Ben was spared having to live with someone he didn't love and learned a valuable lesson. So in the end, everything ended well for everyone. From then on, Ben became more careful. Now he was more careful about choosing girls and never made such mistakes again. Ben graduated from college and, as he had once dreamed, got a job on a ship as a mechanical engineer. Their town was located on the bank of a large, full-flowing river. Steamships and cargo ships traveled along it, so the demand for smart specialists was high. A river. It's great, of course, but I dream of big water. I wish I could go to the sea sometimes. Ben shared his thoughts with Vivian. "But you have to move somewhere, don't you?" said the girl. "Yes, you're right," Ben agreed. "But it's for the best, new places, new life. It's getting crowded here." Vivian felt uneasy at the thought of not having Ben around. She was so used to him. She could call Ben at any time of the day or night to ask for help and know that he would be there. Ben had proven his reliability time and time again. He'd picked up Vivian and her friends from the nightclub when suspicious guys were hitting on them that night. The girls were afraid, but Ben came to pick them up in his used car. He had just recently gotten his license at the time, and his father had bought him a practice car. Ben, with the repair of the roof at his father's cottage, Vivian helped. His parents even jokingly called the neighbor boy their son-in-law. He didn't mind. And once there was a funny case, Vivian stayed the night alone. Her parents had gone to the village to visit relatives. It was summer. It was hot. And suddenly the girl noticed a huge spider on the wall. She'd never seen such a thing before. It was the size of her fist. Of course, the girl squealed loudly and then dialed Ben. He rushed over and spent an hour trying to catch the monster. Finally, the guy managed to cover the spider with a pelvis and shove it into a jar. Later, it turned out to be the pet of their upstairs neighbor. He kept rare insects in his terrarium, and this spider escaped during feeding, and on some passages got to Vivian's apartment. The girl was grateful to Ben for all these situations. To know that you have a person who is always ready to help, it is worth a lot. Of course, Vivian didn't want him to go anywhere out of town, although her childhood crush, as she thought, had already passed at that point. But a trusted friend is even better. Lovers quarrel and separate, but friendship is forever. And now they met by chance in the park and were very happy to see each other. Are you going to your parents? Ben asked. Yes, Vivian smiled at him. I'm getting the papers together because the wedding is coming up. Then we're going to Italy right away. Italy? Ben grimaced. You've thought this decision over so well, haven't you? Of course I have. Why are you reacting this way? Why don't we sit down on the bench and talk, Ben suggested. Vivian nodded. She didn't mind. She always enjoyed spending time with a friend. You see, the boy began, as they settled down on the bench under the lantern. It's a shame about that one, Grace. His name is Grace, Vivian corrected angrily. She didn't like it when Ben called her fiancé so disparagingly. All right, Grace is kind of slippery, insincere. I've seen him a couple times, but I've noticed that he's going out of his way to make everyone like him. And everyone's falling for it. Everyone but you? Yes, except me. Ben nodded his head. Don't you think you're making a big mistake now? You're safe here. You have friends, parents, a job, an apartment. You're protected from every angle and out there. I can't protect you there. That last sentence struck a deep chord in Vivian's soul. Ben. He was so used to protecting her that he was afraid to let her go to a foreign country because he couldn't look after her. I don't need protecting, Vivian smiled at him. Grace and I love each other. We have a wonderful relationship. I saw Trixie the other day. She says your husband's having some business problems. What a talker, Vivian said jokingly. Yes, I was sharing my worries with her. Grace was discussing his problems with someone on the phone. Well, it's okay, he'll get over it. Businessmen have problems all the time. They happen all the time. I wish he'd solved his problems first, then gone to his fiancée. Ben shook his head. A normal man would have done that. You're acting like the strict older brother I never had, Vivian grinned. But it feels good. If you'd gotten to know Grace better, you might have liked him. I doubt it, Ben shook his head. He's slippery. He's got something dirty on his mind. I'm a good judge of character. That's why I almost married that redhead who tricked you into getting pregnant. He reminded Vivian of an incident from his youth. She thought the boy was going to smile and say something funny, but he only shook his head seriously and said, "Well, you compare. I was almost a child then, an 18-year-old kid. I'm not that man anymore. I can see Grace is up to something. I don't want you to be his victim or a means to some end." That's ridiculous. He loves me. That's what Trixie tells me. And that Italian looks at you with admiration. He anticipates your every wish and showering you with gifts. But you good and honest girls don't need much. You're easily fooled. But what do you think it would profit Grace to marry me? Vivian put her hand on Ben's shoulder. A friendly, soothing gesture. Money. A marriage of convenience. But that's silly. He's a rich man. I'm the daughter of middle-class parents. So what's the catch? Are you sure he's that rich? Did you ask him for his real estate documents? Did you even look at his passport? Did you see his income statement? What are you talking about? No, of course not. I didn't ask him any of that. It's obvious. He lived in Italy. He drove around in fancy cars. And he paid for us everywhere. He gave me expensive gifts and even paid for our wedding. A modest dinner at a restaurant. You don't need a lot of money for that. And your presents aren't that fancy. Trixie told me all about it with delight. Of course he had her fooled. But bouquets of flowers, candy, even a dress. It's not like your rich man's that broke. Even a student can afford that. Is that really the point? Vivian was getting angry. Why are you even picking on him? I'm sorry, Ben suddenly softened. It's just that I'm very, very afraid for you. You know, worried. Don't be. I'm going to be fine. I'm going to be great. I hope so. The conversation with Ben had thrown Vivian off balance. Until that dialogue, she'd thought she was doing the right thing. But her childhood friend had touched a note of doubt in her soul. Vivian herself was tormented by a vague premonition, something elusive. Grace behaved impeccably, still looked at the bride with admiration, still tried to please her in everything. He also showered her with compliments and spoke of their wonderful future together. But sometimes there was something in his gaze, either discontent or contempt. The girl wrote it off as homesickness and concern about the affairs left so long in Italy. Probably Grace was worried about how things were going without him there. But nothing. Soon they will fly to Italy and live happily ever after. Just like in a fairy tale. It's a little scary, of course. Another country, another mentality. Everything is completely different. No friends around, no relatives. Ben's right about that. On the other hand, they will all come to visit her, and Vivian will gladly introduce them to a wonderful sunny country. Beautiful streets, gentle sea, smiling passers-by. Not at all like the streets of their hometown. Most importantly, she and Grace will be together. The feelings between them are so sincere and strong. Together they could handle anything. If Vivian had any doubts after her conversation with Ben, Grace, who greeted her with a wide smile and a warm embrace, immediately remedied the situation. He loves her. They will be happy together. That night, Vivian couldn't sleep. Grace was sitting in the other room, typing a message to someone on his laptop. It was a routine thing to read business emails, send replies. Big business requires constant involvement. The guy often repeated the phrase. Vivian liked that Grace seemed so easygoing, cheerful, and even a little joking. But at the same time, when it came to business, he was collected, responsible, serious. You couldn't go wrong with him. Grace, of course, is good in himself, with such a nice heaven and a coven. But Vivian wouldn't be living in a crib, more like a palace. A rich, handsome Italian is in love with her and is ready to do anything for her. Vivian could not imagine such a thing even in her wildest fantasies. No, the girl always knew what young people like. This was evidenced by the numerous compliments and the corresponding looks of guys. Vivian, back in school, was often called for dates, and at the graduation she was constantly invited to dance. The girl was even tired and wanted to sit a little and take a break, only afraid to offend the cavaliers. But still, Grace is so handsome, so rich, and so smart. He needs a girl to match him. A Hollywood actress or a top model, no less. And he chose her, a simple girl. Pretty sure, but not a star or the daughter of wealthy parents. It's weird. Too much like a fairy tale. Trixie was jealous in a good way, and even asked Vivian to look around to see if there was a suitable suitor. Why? It would be wonderful to have a childhood friend suddenly at her side. Of course, Vivian would try to introduce Trixie to someone. Grace, it turns out, has a lot of brothers, even if they're not siblings. He's an only child himself. Trixie's cute, even though she's self-conscious about her supposed fullness. Isn't she a bride? And what wonderful photos Vivian will take in Italy. She already has a page on the internet where she posts her work and praises it. Even asks to sell some pictures. They are really beautiful. Vivian knows how to notice interesting and unusual things. But Italy is a completely different nature and architecture. Exotic, colorful. Vivian already anticipated the future excitement on her page. She will definitely familiarize her compatriots with this unique country through photos. Let them admire it too. Maybe she will even realize her dream. As the wife of a wealthy man, Vivian will probably be able not to work. Why should she? If Grace is going to provide for her family, and what would she do? Her degree in economics is unlikely to be valid in a foreign country. Different laws, different accounting rules. But the girl will be able to do her favorite thing. She'll take pictures. Who knows, maybe in the future it will bring her not only pleasure, but also money. And if not, it's okay. Now you don't have to worry about finances. Grace is incredibly rich. It's a very nice addition to the man you love." And then the phone rang. "Grace." Someone was on the video conference. Vivian was all ears. No, she wasn't the type to eavesdrop on conversations out of curiosity. She just wanted to check herself to see how far she'd gotten in her Italian. Matthew, one of Grace's cousins, was on the line. First, the boys greeted each other, exchanged news, and in this short dialogue, to her satisfaction, Vivian understood every word clearly. But then the conversation took a strange turn. The girl understood everything, but she forgot to think about her success in Italian. The content of the dialogue was too suspicious and disturbing. "Well, are you going to get the money soon?" Matthew questioned. "And you think this kind of thing is quick?" Grace's voice sounded annoyed. "The wedding, the moving. Then there's still time to get it ready. So why don't we start preparing now? What's the holdup?" "No, you can't scare her off. You don't know anything about these things." Vivian froze on her bed. What was that now? Was it really about her? What should she be prepared for? What would scare her off? Somehow this all sounded very unpleasant. And then I remembered what Ben had said about Grace being slippery. He did seem that way now. "Are you sure your plan will work?" Matthew clarified with a clear threat in his voice. "I'm sure it's almost done. Just the finishing touches are left." "Well, watch this, or you know you're in debt. And if you can't pay it back in money, we'll take it another way." It won't come to that. Grace tried to speak in a steady voice, but it was clear that he was in anxiety. With that, the brothers said their goodbyes and Grace went on with his letters. And Vivian? Of course she could not sleep now and kept going over the details of the strange conversation. And she liked that conversation less and less. This Matthew, whom Grace called brother. He'd spoken to Vivian's fiancé in a dismissive manner, not unlike a cousin and business partner. Matthew was threatening Grace, and the latter was talking about some plans, money, and debts. Vivian's first impulse was to approach her fiancé and ask him directly about everything, but the girl held back. That was not the way to do it. If Grace is really deceiving her, he will come up with something convincing this time. If the groom was honest, Vivian's suspicions might offend him. It's not nice to know your significant other doesn't trust you. No, that's not what Vivian will do. Now she will simply become more attentive, will listen, look closely, notice some important details. Eventually, the girl will find out the truth. For the next few days, nothing unusual happened. Grace was as charming as ever. Vivian even relaxed a little, forgot about the accidentally overheard conversation. The groom had a hypnotic effect on her. His gaze, his warm embrace, and his words that seemed to be able to pacify, to make her feel happy. With no one else had Vivian experienced such feelings. Vivian had not experienced such feelings before. And yet, when Grace once again called her mother from Italy via video call, Vivian turned to listen. She was in the kitchen at the time, Grace in the living room. The girl was washing dishes. The water was running noisily in the room. That was probably why Grace was convinced that the bride had not heard the bell. But Vivian, after her fiancé's strange conversation, did not blame herself for her excessive curiosity. The girl went to the door of the parlor and listened. She needed to know everything, absolutely everything about the man with whom she was going to tie her fate. Grace seemed to be hiding something. Perhaps his conversation with his mother would resolve this doubt. Vivian already realized that her fiancé was not as sincere and honest as he tried to seem, but she was not ready to hear such a thing. Grace's conversation with her mother turned out to be quite frank. He opened the girl's eyes to the situation in which she found herself. "Hello, son," the woman said affably, looking up from the screen at her son. "Hi, Miss Yu and little Lulu," Vivian smiled. She knew that Italians had a very strong attachment to their mothers, and thought that was a rather lovely fact. Here now, the grown-up Grace had unashamedly confessed to his mother that he missed her and his little sister. I wish you'd come back already. So is the wedding coming up soon? In a week. It's not much longer. Then we'll go straight home. We'll almost have to pack. Does she know yet? No, it's too early to tell her. When we get to Italy, her relatives and acquaintances won't be around. It's a very different situation. I shall have much more influence over her there. Vivian froze. There she was again. They're talking of some dangerous plans for her, intrigues. What was going on at all? Vivian suddenly realized she didn't want to go to Italy, and Grace could hardly be trusted. "You're so smart," the woman on the other side of the screen said with pride in her voice. "Your father was the same way, but you're even smarter. You've had a lot of wisdom since you were a child. Does this poor girl really believe that you are in love with her? You're so handsome and she thinks you're rich." Poor thing is the most hurtful expression for Vivian's blonde, this woman, future mother-in-law. She smiled so affectionately in her face and called her beautiful, while she herself is like an evil stepmother from a typical fairy tale. "You know I know how to be gallant when necessary, we will take into account," she said. She just lost her head over me. And it's so easy. A very simple task. She's as naive as a child. Well, all the better. You bet. Back in Italy, when I took her and that friend of hers for a ride in the rental car, I negligently forgot to remove the rental tag from the passenger seat. And she didn't notice. She believed I owned an expensive sports car. She was so surprised. You should have seen her at that moment. There's nothing to be surprised about. She doesn't understand Italian, so she didn't realize it. By the way, are you sure your fiancé doesn't know the language? They don't. She can only translate a few words of Italian, that's all. She's not very bright at all. Lucky for us. Maybe we shouldn't be so frank in front of her. Don't worry. First of all, we're talking fast, so she won't get the point. And second of all, she's in the kitchen right now doing the dishes. The water's running. That fool doesn't even know I'm talking to you. That's good, my boy, because I have a lot of questions for you. What kind of questions? I think we've talked about this a bunch of times. But let's go over the basics again. How are you going to tell the girl that you're going to live in a tiny apartment in Rome instead of going to our non-existent estate with huge vineyards? That's nonsense. I'll say that I have business in the capital and will stay in my studio apartment here for the time being. I've already rented it for a few weeks. Oh, it's costing me a lot of money. At first I let the dust in my eyes, rented cars, took them to clubs in Italy, gave them gifts. Now I live in her apartment. I save money, like a hotel, but I have to buy groceries and cook dinners for her to maintain influence on her. Now I've got this rented apartment in Rome. It's okay. If it works out, you'll cover all your expenses and pay off some of your debts, Grace said. Yeah, the most urgent debts have to be paid off soon. Ultimo is harassing me, threatening me. He doesn't want to wait any longer. I told you not to mess with him, the woman said with concern in her voice. I thought I'd make good money with him. But that's how it turned out. Now I got to make it work. First of all, you'll pay off the motel debt, and then you'll take care of the bank loans. See if we can get out of this debt hole of ours. I'm sorry I can't help you. Come on, Mom, you're always so supportive, aren't you? Vivian stood at the door. She'd already realized that Grace had lied to her. Lied to her from the start. He wasn't a businessman, he was in debt. And Ben wasn't his cousin at all. Grace owed money to dangerous people. He's been pushed to the wall, and the charming Italian is desperately looking for a way out. The fancy cars aren't his. They were rented. The apartment where the newlyweds planned to go after the wedding was also rented, although Grace claimed he'd recently bought it with money he'd earned. Vivian had noticed the pride and fire in his eyes. It was horribly disgusting, disgusting. It's also frightening, disturbing. It was not clear what part she, Vivian, played in this scheme. What was she to do with it? Mother and son continued their conversation in full confidence that no one would hear them, and if they did, they would not understand. "Your fiancée, doesn't she know anything?" Grace asked. "No, why should she?" She grinned. "She's in love with me, like Juliet with Romeo. She looks at me with loving eyes and agrees with every word I say, so it won't be hard to convince her to sell the apartment, especially once we're in Italy, away from her family. And I'll give the money to Ben, and Ultimo will finally be off my back." Vivian felt as if she'd been hit over the head with a bag. That's it. Turns out Grace was in on the whole thing because of her real estate. Yeah, her parents bought her an expensive apartment in an upscale neighborhood. You can get a lot of money for that, and she needs the money, Grace. That's what her plan is. A young, charming con artist has run up debts. She's being threatened. She needs to pay the money back fast. So the bastard comes up with a brilliant plan. Except it's not going to work. What luck that Vivian once decided to go to these language courses. A chill suddenly ran down her spine. She was scared. She is alone with a person who is probably a criminal. At the very least, she definitely had some dealings with Ben, and the latter is a real criminal by the looks of it. Grace is a scary person. I don't know what she's capable of. And Vivian is alone here, all alone. She took her cell phone out of her sweatshirt pocket and, without leaving her observation post, began to write messages. To whom? She texted Eden, of course, out of habit. He was always there for her in difficult situations. And now, his presence and support would be of great help now. Vivian did not leave the door of the parlor. The conversation was not yet over. What if she found out something else interesting? She did. Grace and her son went on to discuss how they'd gotten to Vivian in the first place. It turned out that the criminal couple made their money by seducing rich female tourists of all ages, staying in their rooms overnight, and then disappearing in the morning with jewelry and cash. As a rule, the women were embarrassed to go to the police. Of course, who would want to admit they'd been duped? A young swindler charmed you, complimented you, then cleaned you out and ran away. Ladies in that situation don't look so good, to put it bluntly. Yeah, even if the victims had gone to the authorities, Grace was virtually impossible to find. He chose a different part of town each time. Each time, he'd change his appearance a little bit and use an assumed name. And of course, the guy would find out where the cameras were in the hotel beforehand and try to stay out of sight. It was a win-win. Except it didn't make much money. Grace had debts, lots of debts. First, bank loans. The guy loved the high life, vacations, expensive cars, brand name clothes. He shamelessly took loans, which then, of course, had nothing to repay, because Grace did not work. He had no education, no desire to work for anyone. That's why Grace got involved with Ben one day. It seemed to the guy that it was a great opportunity to easily and quickly earn a decent sum. But something went wrong. Grace ended up owing dangerous people. They kept calling him, threatening him. The debt increased every day, which drove Grace to despair. He realized that if he couldn't find the money, he might not be spared. Vivian learned all this while standing in front of her own living room door. And then Grace's mother, who was well aware of her son's means of earning money, proposed a wonderful plan to her offspring. And from the conversation between son and mother, Vivian realized that the woman has great power over the guy. He is ready to do anything to please her. The lady didn't work. She kind of took care of the house and her young daughter. They were occasionally kept together by a man, another suitor for Grace's spectacular mother. But these were unstable sources of income that quickly dried up. The main earner remained Grace with his petty scams against rich tourists. It was the mother who encouraged the handsome son to make money this way. Realizing what was going on, Vivian felt something like pity for Grace for a while. It's a terrible thing to be used like that by your own mother. Vivian's unfulfilled mother-in-law decided that in the current situation, The cash and jewelry of rich ladies would not be enough to cover her debts. So she came up with a new, much more risky and complicated way of making money. If it worked out, Grace would have the money to pay off Ben. Grace's mother targeted Vivian herself. She found out through her channels that there were 2 young Russian tourists staying at the hotel and ran a background check on them. Of course, not only Vivian was in the field of vision of the clever ladies, but she turned out to be the most suitable candidate for several reasons. The first and most important, the presence of her own living space, an apartment in the center of her hometown, registered on the girl. Yes, Grace's mother had access to that information. I had to pay a small sum for the database, but the benefit of owning valuable information many times exceeded the cost of the purchase. Secondly, Vivian herself was the perfect victim. Young, inexperienced, gullible. First Grace's mother, and then he himself had watched the girl for days before acting. Hearing this, Vivian shuddered. She was being watched. She was so happy and enthusiastic she didn't even notice anything. Vivian was lucky that mother and son decided to discuss this whole story in great detail and talked about plans and even remembered the past. Now the girl was aware of everything. Further, the conversation between Grace and his mother turned to everyday topics. The weather, the health of some common relatives, the mischief of the groom's little sister Vivian. They made no further mention of their victim, but Vivian already knew all she needed to know. The girl returned to the kitchen and sank powerlessly into a padded chair. Her rose-colored glasses had just shattered with a crash and clink, and as it always happens, with the glasses inward, she was in pain. Unbearably hurt that the beautiful fairy tale and unearthly love had all turned out to be just a deception. And Grace wasn't the perfect prince on a white horse, but a con man. He has no feelings for Vivian, only pure calculation. According to Grace and his mother's plan, Vivian was to be the wife of the con man. Together they would go to another country, live in a rented apartment, which Vivian would consider Grace's property for the time being. Then the young husband would ask her to sell the apartment, and Vivian would agree. Of course she would. Grace would surely think of some plausible excuse. He'd been working her over so skillfully all this time that there was no doubt Vivian would sell the apartment and give him the money. And then the divorce. And Vivian would be alone in a foreign country with no money and no support. Of course, her parents would not abandon her in a difficult situation, would send money for a ticket, and the girl would return to her native country, where she would no longer have her own apartment. Even to imagine such an outcome is scary. In Grace, he would have gotten away with it, because legally he did nothing wrong. Vivian would have sold the apartment herself and handled the money herself, giving it to her spouse as she saw fit. There is no crime. It doesn't seem to exist in this situation. What kind of cunning plan? But Vivian did figure it out. She decided to wait until Ben arrived, to whom she'd written a couple of messages. Until then, she would do nothing. Who knew how Grace would behave when she realized that his plan had failed? I mean, this was a long-term project for the con man. The guy invested a lot of time, effort, and money to impress Vivian and create the image of a rich groom. The con man had to go to a lot of expense. Oh, he's going to be pissed. It would be better if Vivian wasn't alone at the moment of exposure. But the girl did not hold back. After speaking to her mother, Grace entered the kitchen with a fond smile on her lips. Now she seemed to Vivian unpleasant and insincere. But only half an hour ago she had been admiring the dimples on her lover's cheeks, which appear when he smiles, admiring and feeling happy and loved. "Shall I help you, my love?" Grace asked, pushing Vivian away from the sink where she was washing plates. "I'm getting used to the royal life. In my house you won't be doing kitchen duties, dishes, washing, or laundry." Here Vivian couldn't take it anymore. Restrained anger, despair, and frustration burst forth in a mighty torrent. "Of course I won't be a maid in your house," exclaimed the girl. "I shall never be in your house at all, because you have no house at all." Grace, perhaps for the first time since the day of their acquaintance, looked confused. The boy flapped his long eyelashes and shook his head. "I know everything," Vivian repeated calmly, looking into Grace's eyes. She was triumphant at this moment. He thought she was a naive simpleton, an easy victim, trying to take advantage of the inexperience of a girl in love. "Well, you got the wrong girl. Vivian isn't that simple." "How did you know that?" Grace seemed to realize there was no point in denying it. "You spoke too frankly to your mother in the purest Italian," Vivian blurted out. Grace's eyes widened in surprise. Yes, as the girl had once planned, she had impressed him with her knowledge of Italian, just not in the situation in which it was supposed to happen. Grace was angry. The girl noticed it at once. A bad glint appeared in his eyes. His hands clenched into fists so white his knuckles turned white. Vivian tensed. She was afraid. She suddenly realized that she had been wrong to snap, wrong to change her decision to hold on until Ben arrived. But Vivian didn't show her fear. "Get out of my apartment," she sternly ordered her estranged husband. "Right now I'll pack your things and leave them on the doorstep. And then leave immediately, or I'll call the police." "I will," Grace whispered, slowly approaching Vivian. She instinctively retreated to the windowsill. Like a frightened bird, she wondered what he could do to her in her condition. He was obviously up to something evil. "I'll leave, but I'll pay my expenses first. The money I spent on you. That's fair, isn't it? Give me your jewelry, your money. Your money. What else you got?" "I'll leave." That's how Grace's veneer of sincerity and benevolence came off. Now Vivian was faced with a greedy and unpleasant man, a fraud, a cheat, a deceiver who might even be capable of physically harming her. How frightful. "I don't have any jewelry," she whispered. Her fervor had worn off. Now she felt only horror in the face of the all-consuming danger that would rob her of her will and paralyze her. Grace rushed into the rooms, smashing and breaking everything in his path. Vivian could hear him slamming closet doors, searching for something to sell. The boy was desperate. In such a state, a man, especially a man like Grace, could do anything. Vivian tried to leave the apartment, but Grace pushed her away from the door and shouted at her so much that she immediately realized that the next time she went out like that could have serious consequences. Vivian sat in the kitchen with her arms around her head, listening to Grace ransacking her apartment. And then Ben showed up. Vivian had always been excited to see her friend. But now it was something special. The girl felt like a mountain had been lifted off her shoulders. Ben quickly assessed the situation. When he noticed Vivian huddled in the corner of the kitchen, he became furious. Cussing and fighting sounds came to the girl's ears. "Get out of here." Ben literally threw Grace out of the apartment and then dialed the police. He spoke loudly and clearly so that Grace, who kept banging on the closed door, could make out every word. Then Ben rushed to Vivian, put his arms around her. The girl clung to him. She was shivering. Tears were streaming down her cheeks. So many events, so many emotions. Ben stroked her back, her hair, her shoulders, said something soothing and affectionate, nodding his words, not asking unnecessary questions. Realized that the girl was in the wrong state of mind right now. A few months passed. Grace returned to Italy. The police did not start a case of a con man on him. Lucky him. On his hand played the fact that he and Vivian had time to apply to the registry office, that is, considered a bride and groom. So the guy wasn't prosecuted for breaking into someone else's home. After all, the landlady was not a stranger to him. The whole situation looked like a personal quarrel, a misunderstanding between spouses, a domestic dispute. And Vivian had no proof that Grace was a con man and a con artist. The Italian left America a pauper. Vivian didn't know how he'd gotten over his failure. She didn't really care, by and large. Vivian posted her story on every travel forum she could find. She detailed how she had fallen for the scammer and even posted pictures of Grace. Perhaps it would help at least someone to avoid meeting the scoundrel. Vivian was not long worried, thwarted wedding. For it wasn't long before she received another proposal. This time from Ben. Then, that terrible evening, sitting on the kitchen floor, the young people frankly talked. It turned out that Ben had been in love with Vivian since childhood and therefore was very jealous of her overseas fiancé. And then when he met Grace in person, he was the only one of the company who was not affected by the foreigner's charms. "I mean, you were in love with me?" Vivian stared at the boy. The surprise that followed this confession, for the time being, even overshadowed the emotion of Grace's disclosure. "I was your secret admirer, and you thought of me only as a girlfriend." "You've said that many times yourself," Ben smiled. "All I had to do was watch your many affairs from the sidelines and wish desperately that I could be one of those guys someday." "What fools we were," Vivian laughed. "Thanks to that Grace of yours. He really is an angel, isn't he? It's thanks to him that we've finally gotten it all straightened out. I've had a crush on you since first grade. But I didn't think I'd be attracted to you as a guy. That's why I became your friend. So I could at least be there for you, keep you safe." Anyway, Vivian was getting ready to get married again, only with a completely different man. This time she had no doubts or worries. Everything was going right now.